Thank you for joining in today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Weight of the Slope. This is a horror story about the Shunka Warak'in. And in this story, in a remote, decaying logging town in the Midwest, nestled against a dense, suffocating forest. The town is struggling. Most of the youth have left, and the remaining residents are insular and superstitious. The town's pets are vanishing, not just missing, but completely erased from their yards, leaving behind only crushed fences and a strange, musk-heavy scent of rotting cedar. The second story today is called The Boot on the Rock. This is a horror story about the Burrunjor. And in this story, a group of university researchers and local trackers have set up a containment outpost in a remote sector of the Northern Territory. They believe they are studying a localized ecological anomaly. The atmosphere is one of arrogant scientific confidence. They have motion sensors, thermal cameras, and reinforced fences. They believe they are the hunters, not the hunted. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Weight of the Slope. It was not a dog. Rhys Vance knew this with the terrible certainty of a man who had spent 15 years diagnosing the invisible fractures in living things, who could read the architecture of pain in the tremor of a muscle or the dilation of a pupil, and who now, crouched beneath the heavy oak table in the drafty front room of the Hollowbrook boarding house, found his considerable vocabulary reduced to a single, silent repetition: not a dog. The thing that paced the hardwood floor in front of him did not register as light. It registered as the abolition of it. A dog-shaped void, his mind supplied, a clinical and detached phrase that did nothing to steady the hammering of his heart against his ribs. The floorboards creaked under a weight that seemed distributed wrong, each step a heavy, sloped lurch that dragged across the grain of the wood with a sound like dull claws carving wax. He could see the paws, mismatched, one broad and heavy as a bear's, the other narrower but longer, both ending in dark, horned nails that clicked and scratched in an arrhythmic pattern that made his teeth ache. The legs above them were wrong too long for the body they supported, bent at angles that suggested a spine designed for a different geometry of gravity, and the slope of the back rose like a hill against the faint moonlight filtering through the kitchen window. A ridge of muscle and bone that blocked the room's ambient glow and swallowed it whole. Rhys held his breath. His lungs burned. His diaphragm spasmed, begging for release, but he did not dare. From the darkness near the base of the stairs, where the shadows pooled thick as ink, a whisper emerged, barely a shaping of air, but it carried with the clarity of a shouted warning. Stop breathing. It doesn't hear the air. It hears the pulse. The words belonged to Bate Crenshaw, the local historian who had arrived in the dying town of Burden's Hollow 6 months prior with a recorder and a theory, and who now hid somewhere in the blackness of the adjacent hall, pressed against a wall that would offer no protection if the thing decided to turn. Rhys closed his eyes. He tried to slow his heart. He thought of veterinary textbooks, of the calming techniques used on prey animals in the moments before euthanasia, of alpha waves and parasympathetic responses, but his body betrayed him. His pulse thundered in his temples, in his throat, in the hollows of his wrists, a drumbeat of warm, living blood that he was certain the void could taste. The pause stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, it was occupied. It was the silence of something listening with organs humans did not possess, mapping the room not by photons but by pressure, by the subtle displacement of air caused by trembling flesh, by the infrasonic thrum of cardiac muscle. A low sound issued from the void then, not a growl, but a vibration that seemed to originate in the floor itself, and travel up through the table legs and into Rhys's bones. A resonant hum that matched the frequency of his terror, and amplified it until his vision blurred at the edges. Then mercifully, the pause began to move again, that heavy, sloped gait carrying the absence toward the back door, and the pressure in the room shifted as the thing passed, a vacuum pulling at Rhys's clothes, at the hair on his arms. He heard the screen door tear free from its frame with a shriek of rusted hinges, and then the night outside swallowed it, and the moonlight returned weak and sickly to the kitchen floor. Reese exhaled. The breath came out as a sob. He did not move for another 10 minutes. The story of how Reese Vance came to be hiding under a table in Burden's Hollow, Michigan, began 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday in late October when the first dog vanished. Reese had arrived in August, fleeing a disgrace that still burned behind his sternum like swallowed acid. He had been a promising veterinarian once, attached to a prestigious clinic in Ann Arbor, with a specialty in large animal orthopedics and a reputation for steady hands and an even steadier temperament. That had ended with a single lawsuit, a tragic miscalculation of anesthesia during a complicated equine birth, and the slow, grinding erosion of his career by a board of inquiry that had found no criminal negligence but plenty of reason to ensure he would never practice again in the state. The details still woke him at 3 in the morning, the phantom weight of a syringe in his fingers, the sound of a client's scream curdling in his memory like milk left in the sun. He had driven north with no destination, his sedan packed with crates of medical textbooks and a growing certainty that he no longer deserved to heal anything, until the highway deposited him in Burden's Hollow, a town that seemed to have been left behind by the 20th century and forgotten entirely by the 21st. It sat in the crease of a valley in the Upper Peninsula, pressed against the eastern edge of the Ottawa National Forest, a dense and suffocating expanse of old-growth pine and cedar that seemed to lean over the town like a patient predator. The logging industry that had birthed Burden's Hollow in the 1880s had long since collapsed, leaving behind a skeletal infrastructure of rotting corduroy roads, rusted skidders abandoned in clear cuts now reclaimed by birch and alder, and a population of 412 souls who regarded outsiders with the flat, evaluative stare of trout in a dwindling stream. Most of the youth had fled south to Green Bay or Marquette, leaving behind the elderly, the stubborn, and the trapped. Reese had rented the upstairs room at Hollowbrook, the only boarding house still operating, from a widow named Mrs. Gable who spoke in monosyllables and smelled of camphor and grief. He had intended to stay 2 weeks, perhaps a month, until he figured out what penance looked like. He was still there when the dogs began to disappear. It was not a phenomenon announced by headlines or emergency broadcasts. It accrued like sediment, noticed first by the town's remaining pet owners in the quiet horror of empty backyards and crushed chain-link fences. Old Man Ketchum's coonhound, a vicious but loyal bruiser named Roosevelt, was the first. Ketchum found the fence in his yard flattened, not bent or broken, but pressed downward into the mud as if a steamroller had passed over it, the diamond mesh embedded in the earth to a depth of 4 inches. There was no blood, no fur, no sign of struggle beyond the single, inexplicable compression. Ketchum, who had survived 2 heart attacks and a logging accident that had taken 3 fingers, stood in his yard at dawn and felt a fear he could not name, a sense that something had visited his property with an intentionality beyond animal hunger. The sheriff, a pot-bellied man named Dern who had held the position for 20 years without ever drawing his weapon, wrote it off as a bear. But bears do not flatten fences without leaving claw marks. They do not leave behind a scent of rotting cedar so thick it stings the nostrils and lingers for days. Then Mrs. Pyerly's 2 terriers vanished from their raised kennel, the wire door torn from its hinges and crumpled like tissue paper, the cedar chips inside scattered in a pattern that suggested something had rooted through them not with snouts, but with a broad, searching mass. The Hendersons lost their German shepherd. The seasonal workers at the old Milner Mill, a group of 4 young men from Flint who had come north for the dubious promise of winter logging contracts, lost their communal pit bull, a scarred veteran of dogfights who had never shown fear of anything human. Each disappearance followed the same architecture, crushed or flattened containment, an absence of remains, and that musk, heavy and sweet as decaying lumber, hanging in the air like a warning written in olfactory script. By the end of October, Burden's Hollow had lost 11 dogs, and the remaining residents had begun locking their doors at night, a practice most had abandoned in the 1970s. Reese might have remained a detached observer, a man too consumed by his own ruin to engage with the anxieties of a dying town, had he not been drawn into the orbit of Bate Crenshaw. He met her on a Thursday in the Hollow's single public space, a combination library and historical society housed in a decommissioned Lutheran church on Elm Street. The building smelled of mildewed hymnals and dust, and its stained glass windows cast pale, colored rectangles across the floorboards where pews had once stood. Bate was camped at a folding table near the altar, surrounded by cardboard boxes of township records, her dark hair tied back in a messy knot, her fingers stained with the sepia of old newspaper ink. She was researching indigenous folklore, she told him without looking up from a crumbling ledger, specifically the oral traditions of the Ojibwe and Cree that had filtered into the region before the lumbermen had clear-cut their world into submission. Reese, who had entered the church seeking silence and found instead the rustle of turning pages, had intended to leave, but something in Bates' intensity arrested him. She spoke of the forest not as a resource or a backdrop, but as a territory with memory, with agency, with a history of predation that predated human maps. When he asked what she was looking for, she had finally looked up, and her eyes, pale gray and unsettlingly direct, held his with the gravity of someone who had already seen the shape of a coming storm. "Displacement," she said. "I'm looking for what happens when something decides it owns the woods again." Their acquaintance deepened through November, a month of shortening days and snow that fell in heavy, wet blankets, silencing the town under a muffling white that seemed less like weather and more like a conspiracy of concealment. Bate had rented a room at Hollowbrook as well, 2 doors down from Reese, and they began taking their evening meals together at the town's only diner, a Formican neon grotto called the Timberline, where the coffee tasted of burnt almonds and the pie was always stale. It was there that she shared her findings, spreading photocopied pages across the sticky table between them while the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects. The documents were fragmentary, drawn from oral histories transcribed by WPA workers in the 1930s, from letters written by Jesuit missionaries in the 1840s, from archaeological surveys conducted by university teams in the 1960s and promptly buried. They spoke of a creature known to the local tribes by a name that Bate could not pronounce with human vocal cords, a name that translated roughly to the one who carries off dogs, or, in older dialects, the weight that walks. The Shunka Warak'in, she called it, using a transliteration from the Iowa that had filtered north through trade and war. It was not a wolf, though it was wolf-like. It was not a bear, though it bore the mass. It was something that occupied a niche no zoologist had ever catalogued, an apex predator that did not hunt for sustenance alone but for dominance, for the establishment of territory through the systematic elimination of competing carnivores. "It doesn't just kill," Bates said, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the diner's crackling radio. "It displaces, it pushes everything else out. The wolves leave, the coyotes vanish, even the birds stop singing. It creates a silent zone around itself, a buffer of fear where nothing else can live. And then when the forest is empty, it starts on the settlements." Reese had listened with the skeptical patience of a man trained in empirical science, but the hairs on his arms had risen despite himself. He had noticed the silence, had he not? The woods around Burden's Hollow were preternaturally quiet, even for late autumn. No crows calling from the bare branches. No jays screaming warnings. The occasional snap of a twig under the weight of a deer, perhaps, but even those had grown scarce since the first snow. The forest felt held, he thought, like a breath drawn in and held for too long, and the pressure of that withheld exhalation pressed against the edges of the town like a physical weight. He had mentioned this to Bate, and she had nodded, her expression grave. "The silent zone," she said. "It's already here. It's been here longer than we realized. We thought we were observing a town with a missing dog problem. We're actually standing in the middle of a culling ground." The first evidence that Bates' academic terror had corporeal teeth arrived on the morning of November 17th, a Tuesday distinguished by a sky the color of old nickels and a wind that carried the smell of coming ice. Hank Beaudry, who farmed 60 acres of marginal land at the northern edge of town, where the forest pressed closest against human habitation, had risen before dawn to check on his stock. Beaudry was a man of considerable bulk and limited imagination, a third-generation dairy farmer who had transitioned to beef when the milk market collapsed, and who regarded the natural world with the proprietary suspicion of a landlord inspecting a tenant's damaged deposit. He owned 2 prize bulls, Hereford crossbreeds named Grant and Lee, each weighing in excess of 2,000 pounds, and possessed of the placid, muscle-bound docility that characterized their kind. They were his pride and his insurance policy, kept in a reinforced pole barn 100 yards from his house, sheltered from the wind by a stand of white pine that had somehow escaped the logging era. When Beaudry opened the barn door that morning, his flashlight beam caught a scene that his mind refused to process for several long seconds, the way a computer freezes when asked to execute a command that violates its operating parameters. The barn was intact. The heavy sliding door had not been breached. The padlock hung from its hasp, undisturbed. But inside, the interior had been transformed into an abattoir painted in geometries of violence that defied rational explanation. Grant and Lee were dead. They had not been eaten. They had not been dragged or chased or dispatched with the quick efficiency of a predator seeking meat. They had been crushed. Beaudry's beam played over Grant first, illuminating a body that looked as though it had been dropped from a great height, though the roof of the barn was undamaged and there was no mechanism by which such a fall could have occurred. The bull's skull had been flattened, the thick bone of the cranium driven inward until the facial structure resembled a stepped-on pumpkin, the eyes burst from their sockets and hanging in gelatinous strings against the pulverized muzzle. The spine had been snapped not at a single vertebra, but along its entire length, a continuous compression that had driven the individual bones together like a telescoped walking stick, reducing the bull's impressive bulk by nearly a third. The rib cage had exploded outward, the bones driven through the hide to project like pale, bloody fingers grasping at the air. And strangest of all, pressed into the flesh of the bull's back and flank, were impressions that Beaudry would later describe to Sheriff Dern as like a mattress had been laid on him and filled with cement. Broad, heavy depressions in the musculature that suggested an immense weight had been brought to bear not with teeth or claws, but with the simple, terrible physics of mass applied deliberately and without haste. Lee was worse. The second bull had apparently tried to flee, judging by the scored hoof marks in the barn's dirt floor, but had been intercepted near the far wall. Here the violence had taken on an almost surgical quality. The creature had pinned the bull by its hindquarters, crushing the pelvic girdle into a paste of bone, meal, and marrow that had sprayed across the wooden posts in a fan-shaped pattern still wet and gleaming when Beaudry arrived. The legs, deprived of their skeletal anchor, had twisted into configurations that made Beaudry's stomach lurch, and the creature had then, inexplicably, used its elongated muzzle or some other appendage to snap the bull's forelegs at the radius and ulna, rendering the animal immobile before the final compression of the skull. There were no bite marks, no claw marks, only the evidence of overwhelming, directed weight of a predator that killed not to feed, but to disable, to dominate, to reduce magnificent animals to broken anatomies that could not run, could not fight, could only wait for the end beneath a mass they could not see coming. Beaudry's scream brought his wife running from the house, and her scream brought the neighbors, and by mid-morning a crowd of 24 horrified townspeople had gathered at the edge of the barn, held back by Sheriff Dern's outstretched arms and the visceral impossibility of what lay inside. Reese arrived with bait, summoned by the commotion, and by a presentiment of doom that had settled in his chest like a swallowed stone. He pushed through the crowd, his veterinary instincts overriding his social caution, and stepped into the barn. The smell hit him first. That musk of rotting cedar amplified 1,000-fold by the enclosed space and mingled now with the copper-sweet stench of massive blood loss and the ammoniac tang of voided bowels. He had seen death in many forms, had held animals as they passed, and had learned to regard the transition with a professional detachment that bordered on reverence. But this was different. This was desecration. This was the work of something for whom death was not an end but a language, a statement written in crushed bone and ruptured viscera. He approached Grant's carcass, his boots squelching in the blood-saturated earth, and examined the impressions in the bull's back with trembling fingers. The depressions were broad, spanning nearly 3 feet across at their widest point, and they were not the puncture marks of claws nor the rake marks of teeth. They were smooth, as if a heavy, rounded mass had been pressed down and held. He thought of Bates' research, of the descriptions she had read aloud in the diner, and a cold certainty formed in his gut. "It uses its weight," he said, not realizing he had spoken aloud until Bate answered from the doorway. "Pins them," she said, her voice hollow with comprehension. "That's how it hunts. It doesn't chase, it doesn't ambush from cover. It uses its mass to immobilize and then it crushes. The indigenous accounts described it as the slope that falls. They said its back was built like a ridge, and when it brought that ridge down on prey, nothing could rise again." She stepped into the barn, her face pale but her eyes bright with a terrible fascination. "Look at the walls," she said, pointing. Reese followed her gesture. High on the eastern wall of the barn, above the reach of any bull, were parallel gouges in the wood, deep and ragged, as if something with enormous nails had braced itself there, above the animals, before dropping down. But there was no loft, no rafter strong enough to support the kind of weight that could do this. The gouges were simply there, 8 feet off the ground, spaced in a pattern that suggested limbs too long for the body they served, and below them, smeared across the rough pine in a streak that glistened in the flashlight beams, was a thick mucus-like substance that smelled of cedar and something older, something fungal and deep earth. Reese touched it. It was warm. The crowd outside had begun to murmur with a new sound, not the shock of horror but the rising pitch of panic, and Sheriff Dern, sensing his authority eroding like sand in a flood, ordered the barn sealed and the witnesses dispersed. He called the state police, but the nearest barracks was 90 miles south, and a late-season blizzard was forecast to close the highways by nightfall. The town was on its own. Reese and Bate walked back to Hollowbrook in silence, the frozen mud crunching beneath their boots, the sky pressing down with the weight of a lead apron. It was then that they began to see it, or rather to see the absence of it, the flicker in the periphery that both of them would later describe in identical terms. A movement in the brush that did not move like a quadruped, not with the fluid grace of a wolf or the bounding energy of a deer, but with a heavy, sloped, rhythmic lurch, a gait that seemed to struggle against gravity with each step, as if the creature's center of mass were located somewhere impossible, high on its back or distributed along a spine that curved like a question mark. They saw it first at the edge of Beaudry's North Field, a dark shape between the bare cornstalks that vanished when they turned to face it, leaving only the impression of a shoulder taller than a man's head and a back that rose in a humped ridge against the tree line. They saw it again from the window of the boarding house, a shadow that paced the tree line behind Mrs. Gable's garden, moving with that same lurching rhythm, pausing when they paused, resuming when they moved. It did not approach. It observed. It mapped their boundaries with the patience of a cartographer plotting a siege. By the 3rd day after the barn slaughter, the seasonal workers had begun to pack their things. The 4 young men from Flint, Mitch, a broad-shouldered 22-year-old with a beard that grew in patches, Jorge, a quiet Guatemalan American who sent half his wages home to his mother, Donna, a wiry woman with a shaved head and a collection of stick-and-poke tattoos, and Cal, a nervous 19-year-old who jumped at loud noises, had been sleeping in the old Milner Mills bunkhouse, a drafty structure of corrugated tin and plywood on the eastern edge of town. They had heard the stories, had seen the flattened fences and smelled the cedar musk. But they were young and armed with the invulnerability of youth, and they had laughed at the old-timers' warnings until the night of November 19th. That night Cal had been on watch. The others had elected him because he was the youngest and because he had lost a game of poker, and he sat on the bunkhouse's single porch with a cheap LED flashlight and a hunting knife, his breath pluming in the cold, staring out at the dark corridor of pines that separated the mill from the forest. At approximately 2 in the morning, he heard the sound of a child crying. It was not the cry of a baby, but the distressed sob of a toddler, high and thin and unmistakably human, coming from the tree line approximately 50 yards away. Cal's first instinct was to run toward it. His second, more rational instinct was to freeze. He called out. The crying stopped. Then it started again, closer, from a different angle, and Cal realized with a cold plunge of terror that the sound was moving, circling the bunkhouse, drawing closer with each iteration. He ran inside and woke the others, and together they huddled in the bunkhouse's common room, armed with axes and a single bolt-action rifle Mitch kept under his mattress, listening to the sobs give way to the screams of a woman begging for help, to the voice of Sheriff Dern calling their names in a perfect imitation that made Jorge's blood run cold because the sheriff's house was 2 miles away, and his voice did not carry that timbre of desperation. The sounds continued until dawn, shifting and mimicking, using the voices of the town's missing, the dogs and perhaps something else, to probe at the edges of their sanity. When the sun finally rose and the sound stopped, the 4 workers emerged to find the bunkhouse surrounded by tracks, not paw prints but deep, sloped impressions in the frost that led away in a zigzag pattern, and hanging from the branch of a nearby birch, tied with what looked like sinew, was the collar of their pit bull, the metal tag polished to a mirror sheen. They left that morning, piling into Mitch's rusted F-150, but the truck's engine would not turn over. The oil pan had been crushed from beneath, the metal punctured by something that had levered up from the ground with impossible precision, and the radiator had been stove in, as if kicked by a horse the size of an elephant. The workers walked out on foot, following the old logging road south, but the storm hit sooner than forecast, and they were forced back to town by whiteout conditions, and a cold that bit through their coats like teeth. They took refuge at Hollowbrook, filling the remaining rooms, and their presence brought the boarding house's population to 9. Reese, Bate, Mrs. Gable, the 4 workers, and 2 elderly sisters from the church choir who had come to stay because their cottage at the southern edge of town felt too exposed. 9 souls, Reese thought, watching the snow pile against the windows in wind-sculpted drifts that resembled grasping fingers. 9 souls in a house with a back door that would not latch and a foundation that groaned in the wind. The first human casualty came on the night of November 20th, a night when the storm howled against the town like a living thing, and the temperature plummeted to 10 below zero. Deputy Morris Calhoun, a 29-year-old who had transferred to Burden's Hollow from Detroit 3 years earlier, seeking solitude and finding instead a career defined by speed traps and minor domestic disputes, had been patrolling the town's perimeter in his cruiser when the radio crackled with a report of a crying child in the woods near Beaudry's farm. The report came from Mrs. Beaudry, who had heard the sound from her kitchen window, and Calhoun, despite every instinct screaming at him to stay in the warm cocoon of his vehicle, felt the obligation of his badge propel him forward. He parked at the edge of Beaudry's north field, his headlights carving pale tunnels through the falling snow, and stepped out into the wind. He was wearing his heavy winter parka, his service weapon holstered at his hip, and a flashlight that cast a beam barely strong enough to pierce the curtain of white. He called out. The crying stopped. Then it resumed, closer now from the tree line, and Calhoun, his sense of duty warped by the acoustic tricks of the storm into a conviction that a child was lost and freezing, plunged into the woods. They found his cruiser at dawn, the engine still running, the driver's door open, the interior already dusted with snow. They found his flashlight first, lying in the snow 20 yards from the tree line, still emitting a weak, failing beam. Then they found his hat, the standard-issue fur-lined cap with the sheriff's department emblem, sitting neatly on a stump as if placed there with deliberate care. The blood trail began 5 feet beyond the stump, a spray of arterial red that painted the snow in a directional fan, suggesting that Calhoun had been struck from behind or above with sufficient force to drive him to his knees instantly. The trail was not long. It extended perhaps 15 feet into the trees, and then it stopped. Not ended. Stopped. As if the body had been lifted cleanly from the earth, but the blood continued, smeared across the lower trunks of the pines in a vertical ascent that defied the physics of any terrestrial predator. It climbed hand over hand as it were, a crimson trail spiraling up the bark to a height of 30 feet, where it terminated in a broad, dark stain on a branch thick enough to support a tremendous weight. They found pieces of him there, not the whole man but portions distributed with a terrible economy, a hand still gloved, gripping a broken branch, a fragment of jaw with teeth intact, a section of rib cage stripped of flesh and curved like a macabre bow. The rest was gone, taken into the canopy or into the earth, and the snow below the branch was compressed in a broad, shallow depression that matched the impressions in Baudry's barn. The tree itself bore the marks of massive claws, gouges in the bark that started 8 feet from the ground and extended upward in parallel lines, and the scent of rotting cedar hung in the frozen air so thickly that several of the searchers vomited into the snow. Reese stood beneath that tree, staring up at the branch where Deputy Calhoun had died, and felt the last vestiges of his scientific skepticism crumble like dry rot. Bates stood beside him, her face buried in a scarf, her eyes streaming from the cold and from something deeper. "It takes them up," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "The old accounts said it could climb. They said it wasn't built for running but for falling. For dropping." She gestured to the vertical blood trail. It climbed above him. It waited, and then it brought its weight down. Reese thought of the slope of the back he had glimpsed in the cornfield, the impossible ridge of muscle and bone, and imagined that mass plummeting from above, the physics of 2,000 pounds of predator dropping from 30 feet, the impact like a grand piano falling from a rooftop onto a pedestrian. He thought of Calhoun's last moment, the realization of shadow above him, the cry frozen in his throat by the shock of impact, and then the crushing, the pinning, the rendering into parts. He turned away from the tree and looked back toward the town, toward the cluster of buildings huddled against the storm, and he understood with a clarity that made his knees weak that the creature was not hunting in the forest anymore. It was hunting the town. It was culling the herd. And the storm was its ally, a blanket of white that muffled screams and obscured tracks and trapped the prey in a confined space from which there was no escape. The siege began in earnest that evening. The storm, which had been predicted to pass by nightfall, stalled over the valley, its low-pressure system locking in place like a thumb pressed down on a map. The highway south was impassable, a fact confirmed by Sheriff Dern's attempt to drive his Jeep to the county line, an attempt that ended with his vehicle mired in a drift that swallowed it to the windows. The power lines went down at 6 p.m., plunging the town into a darkness so complete it felt biblical, and the generator at Hollowbrook coughed to life with a sound like dying lungs, providing only enough electricity to power a few dim bulbs and the ancient space heater in the common room. The 9 residents of the boarding house gathered there, drawn by warmth and by the animal instinct to huddle in groups when predators prowled. Mrs. Gable sat in her rocking chair, knitting needles clicking with a mechanical rhythm that seemed less like calm and more like a prayer. The elderly sisters, Hester and Marie, clutched rosaries and whispered Hail Marys in alternating turns. Mitch sat by the window with his rifle, his eyes red-rimmed and sleepless. Jorge and Donna played cards with trembling hands, the game forgotten before it began. Cal sat in a corner, wrapped in 3 blankets, staring at nothing. Reese and Bates stood by the fireplace, which had been stocked with damp wood that smoked more than it burned, and they spoke in low voices of the thing that was coming. "It doesn't need to get in," Bates said, her eyes reflecting the embers. "It just needs to wait. We're already trapped. The storm, the road, the power, it's all part of the displacement. It pushes everything into a smaller and smaller space, and then it compresses. That's what it does. It compresses." Reese thought of the bulls in the barn, of Calhoun in the tree, and he understood. The creature was not merely killing. It was reducing the complexity of the environment, eliminating variables, herding the remaining life into a central location where its weight could be applied most efficiently. It was a predator that thought in geometries of mass and pressure, that understood structural engineering better than any human architect. He looked at the walls of Hollowbrook, the thick oak planks and the stone foundation, and he wondered how long they would hold. They did not have to wonder for long. At approximately 11 p.m., with the wind screaming around the eaves like a chorus of damned souls, the first impact came. It was not the sound of claws or teeth. It was the sound of a battering ram, a low, thunderous concussion that shook the floorboards and sent a rain of plaster dust cascading from the ceiling. The wall facing the forest, the eastern wall of the common room, bowed inward with a groan of tortured timber, and the ancient oak planks cracked along their grain with a sound like gunshots. Mitch leaped to his feet, bringing the rifle to his shoulder, and Jorge let out a cry that was half scream and half prayer. "Get away from the wall," Reese shouted, pulling Bate back toward the center of the room just as the second impact arrived, and this time the plank splintered, a jagged hole opening to the night, and through that hole poured not wind or snow but a darkness that moved, a mass that filled the aperture and pressed inward with the terrible inevitability of a glacier. They saw it then, truly saw it, in the dim glow of the generator-powered bulbs and the flickering firelight. The Shunka Warak'in was not a wolf. It was not a bear. It was a creature built like a living landslide, its body low and long and sloped from a skull that projected forward on a neck thick as a telephone pole to a back that rose in a humped ridge of bone and muscle, before sloping down again to haunches that seemed designed not for running, but for bracing, for anchoring, for applying pressure. Its fur was not fur but a coarse, bristled hide the color of dead leaves and wet stone, and its legs, those terrible mismatched legs, ended in paws that spread wide as dinner plates, each nail black and hooked and digging into the floorboards for purchase as it pulled its bulk through the gap it had made. Its head swung side to side, the elongated muzzle sniffing the air, and the eyes, when they caught the light, were not eyes at all but pale, filmed orbs like peeled boiled eggs, blind to light but sensitive to other spectra, to heat and vibration and the electromagnetic fields of terror. It opened its mouth. The jaws were wider than a man's shoulders, lined with teeth that did not tear but shear, flat and heavy as masonry chisels, and from deep in that throat issued a sound that was not a roar but a scream, a perfect, ear-splitting replication of Deputy Calhoun's final cry, modulated and thrown forward in a wave of sound that mapped the room in echoes, that told the creature exactly where each heartbeat pulsed, exactly where the warm meat waited. The rifle fired, Mitch squeezing the trigger in a spasm of pure reflex, and the report was deafening in the enclosed space. The creature did not flinch. The bullet struck its shoulder, burying itself in the dense mat of muscle and hide, and the beast turned with a speed that belied its bulk, that heavy sloped gait becoming a lunge that covered the distance between the wall and Mitch in a single, fluid contraction of its coiled spine. Mitch had time to fire once more, the bullet punching harmlessly into the floorboards, and then the creature was on him, not biting but falling, bringing that ridge of back down across Mitch's chest with a sound like a grand piano dropped from a loading dock. The young man's scream was cut off instantly, replaced by the wet crunch of ribs driven into lungs, of the sternum folding like a cardboard box, of the heart itself compressed between the descending weight and the unyielding floor. Blood erupted from Mitch's mouth in a fountain that painted the ceiling, and his body convulsed once, twice, his legs kicking in a spastic dance that sprayed crimson across the horrified faces of the survivors. The creature held the pressure, grinding its weight down, and they heard the sequential pops of vertebrae bursting like corn kernels, the sacrum shattering, the pelvis collapsing into a paste that stained the floorboards black. When it finally shifted, rising with a sound of suction and tearing, Mitch was no longer a person but a diagram of applied physics, a two-dimensional smear of tissue and bone fragments, his head lolling at an angle that suggested his neck had been driven into his torso up to the chin. The creature did not eat him. It left the body where it lay, a territorial marker, a statement of dominance written in meat, and turned its blind eyes toward the next nearest source of heat and vibration. Jorge ran. He made it 3 steps toward the kitchen before the creature's elongated muzzle snapped forward with the speed of a striking python, the jaws closing around his lower leg with a precision that severed the Achilles tendon and shattered the tibia in a single, shearing bite. Jorge fell, screaming, his hands clawing at the floorboards, and the creature dragged him back with a casual efficiency that suggested this was not hunting but husbandry, the culling of stock. It did not crush him immediately. Instead, it pinned him, one massive forepaw pressing down on Jorge's lower back with enough force to drive the lumbar vertebrae apart, and then it began to work on him with its teeth, not feeding but disabling, snapping the radius and ulna of each arm with methodical care. Crushing the ankles, rendering the young man into a broken doll that could not flee, could not fight, could only scream in a continuous, ululating wail that seemed to please the creature, to guide its echolocation as it mapped the room's remaining occupants. Donna, frozen in her chair, watched her friend being dismantled with a paralysis that was not courage but shock, her mind refusing to process the reality of what she was seeing until the creature, finished with Jorge, lifted its blood-wet muzzle and turned its blind gaze directly toward her. It did not charge. It lurched, that heavy sloped gait carrying it across the room in a series of rhythmic compressions, each step denting the floorboards, and when it reached her, it did not bite. It simply fell upon her, the ridge of its back crashing down across her lap and chest with a force that drove her body through the chair and into the floor, the wooden spindles bursting upward through her torso like stakes through a vampire, her scream ending in a wet gurgle as her heart was flattened between the creature's weight and the unyielding oak beneath. The creature rose, shook itself like a dog after a bath, sending a spray of blood and viscera across the walls, and then it paused, listening, mapping the room with Calhoun's stolen scream. Reese had pulled bait toward the staircase, his mind operating on pure adrenaline and the primitive calculus of survival. Mrs. Gable sat frozen in her rocking chair, the knitting needles still in her hands, her mouth open in a silent O of terror. The sisters had collapsed together in a corner, their prayers becoming a single sustained moan. Cal, in his corner, had pulled the blankets over his head, a child's response to a nightmare made flesh. The creature turned toward the staircase, its pale orb seeming to fix on Reese and Bate with a focus that was not sight but something deeper, something that measured the cadence of their hearts and the heat of their blood. The survivors did not flee immediately. Shock held them in place with a grip almost as tight as the creature's jaws, and it was only the sound of claws scraping against the exterior walls of Hollowbrook that galvanized Reese into motion. The pack was circling, heavy bodies pressing against the clapboard siding, the rhythmic scratch of those mismatched paws creating a syncopated percussion that seemed to measure the remaining minutes of their lives. "The church," Bate gasped, her fingers digging into Reese's arm with a pressure that would leave bruises. "The old stone church on Slope Street. The walls are 2 feet thick. The foundation is bedrock. It's the only thing in this town that was built to last." Reese understood. The Hollowbrook boarding house was timber and plaster, a Victorian confection of ornament and fragility, but the first Congregational church had been constructed in 1887 by Scottish masons who had intended it to outlast the forest itself. Its walls were limestone quarried from the valley's western ridge, its doors were oak banded with iron, and its windows, though tall and arched, were set deep in embrasures that would defy the leverage of claws. It was 3 blocks away. 3 blocks of open street, exposed to the storm and the darkness and the things that waited in the snow. He looked at the sisters, Hester and Marie, who still clung to each other in the corner, their faces slack with a dissociation that bordered on catatonia. They would not run on their own. He looked at the hole in the wall, at the snow drifting through it in curtains of white that seemed almost beautiful in their indifference, and he made a decision. "Bait, help me with them. We're going out the front. The back is too close to the tree line." He did not know if this was true, but the front door faced the town's main street, a broader avenue with fewer shadows and, he hoped, fewer places from which a 2,000-pound predator could launch itself. He moved to the sisters, crouching before them and speaking in the low, steady voice he had used on frightened animals in his clinic. "Hester, Marie, we need to leave now. I need you to stand up and hold my arms. Can you do that?" Hester's eyes focused on him slowly, as if surfacing from deep water, and she nodded, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. Marie followed her sister's lead, and together they rose, leaning on each other and on Reese with the fragile dependency of reeds in a wind. Bait had retrieved Mitch's rifle from the floor, though the bolt was jammed with blood and the magazine was empty. She carried it like a club, its wooden stock comforting in its solidity. They reached the front door. Reese turned the knob, the brass cold as a knife against his palm, and he pulled it open onto a world transformed. The storm had intensified, the snow falling now in a horizontal rush that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet, and the wind carried a sound that was not wind but the collective breathing of the pack, a low, rhythmic huffing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The street was buried under 2 feet of fresh powder, and the drifts had climbed the sides of the buildings in soft, encroaching waves that threatened to swallow the town whole. Reese stepped out, the sisters clinging to him, Bait close behind with the rifle raised, and they began to move. The first block was a tunnel of white, the streetlights dead, the only illumination the occasional flash of lightning that turned the world into a stark, black-and-white photograph of desolation. They passed the diner, the timberline, its neon sign dark and dangling from one chain, and they passed the hardware store, its plate glass windows frosted over from the inside as if someone had breathed against them for hours. The wind tore at their clothes, and the cold bit into their exposed skin with a ferocity that was almost animate. But they pressed on, half running, half stumbling, the sisters whimpering with each step. It was on the second block, in the space between the abandoned post office and the gas station that had closed in 1998, that the first attack came. Not from the front, but from above. Reese heard the sound a fraction of a second before impact, a displacement of air like the rush of a descending elevator, and he threw himself forward, dragging the sisters with him, just as a mass the size of a small car crashed into the snow where they had been standing. The creature had launched itself from the roof of the post office, a distance of 30 feet, and it landed with a concussion that drove the breath from their lungs and sent a shockwave through the snow that knocked Bait off her feet. She scrambled up, raising the rifle, and in the flash of lightning she saw it clearly for the first time. The Shunka Warak'in in full, its body low and long, its back rising in that terrible ridge, its fur matted with snow and blood, its pale eyes fixed on the sisters with a predatory focus that seemed almost tender, almost appreciative. It did not roar. It made the sound of a child crying, a high, thin wail that echoed between the buildings and mixed with the wind until the source was indistinguishable from the storm. Then it lunged. Reese had never been a brave man. He had been a careful man, a methodical man, a man who approached problems with scalpels and sutures and the calm detachment of science. But in that moment, as the creature bore down on Hester and Marie with the inevitability of an avalanche, something ancient and unbidden rose in his chest. He released the sisters, shoving them toward Bait, and he stepped into the path of the charge with nothing but his bare hands and a scream of defiance that surprised them both. The creature did not swerve. It lowered its head, the elongated muzzle parting to reveal those shearing teeth, and it struck him not with its jaws but with its shoulder, the mass of its body hitting him like a freight train of meat and bone. Reese flew backward, his body describing a graceless arc through the snow, and he landed against the wall of the gas station with an impact that shattered 2 ribs and drove the air from his lungs in a wet gasp. Pain detonated across his torso, white and obliterating, and he slid down the wall, his vision tunneling, his ears filled with the sound of his own heartbeat stuttering like a failing engine. He saw Bait dragging the sisters away, saw the creature turn from him with the dismissive indifference of a predator that has already categorized its prey as disabled, and he knew that if he did not move, he would die here, frozen and broken, another territorial marker in the snow. But the creature did not pursue Bait. Instead it paused, its blind head tilting, listening, and from the darkness between the buildings emerged a second shape, and then a third, each one moving with that same heavy, sloped lurch, each one carrying the void of their presence like a cloak. The pack. 3 of them, perhaps 4, their bodies blocking the street in a semicircle that compressed the survivors toward the gas station's alcove. They were hurting them, Reese realized through the haze of pain. Just as Bait had predicted, they were not merely hunting but driving, using their mass and their coordination to funnel the remaining humans toward a central point, a killing floor where their weight could be applied with maximum efficiency. The church was still 1 block away, its steeple visible in the lightning as a black finger against the sky, but the path was blocked by living walls of muscle and appetite. Reese crawled to his knees, his broken ribs grinding with a sound like boots on gravel, and he looked for a weapon, anything. His hand closed on a rusted tire iron half buried in the snow near the gas station's pumps, and he pulled it free, the metal cold and heavy and utterly inadequate. The pack began to close in, not rushing but compressing, each step a deliberate reduction of space. The lead creature, the one that had dropped from the roof, made a sound then that was not a mimicry but its own voice, a deep, resonant booming that vibrated in Reese's sternum and seemed to synchronize the heartbeats of the survivors, forcing them into a rhythm that was slower, heavier, hypnotic. It was the same sound he had heard under the table at Hollowbrook, the infrasonic mapping of the room, but amplified now by numbers, coordinated into a choir of pressure that made his vision blur and his muscles slacken. He fought it, biting his tongue until blood filled his mouth, the pain anchoring him to consciousness. He saw Bait backed against the gas station's door, the sisters collapsed behind her, and he saw the creatures approaching with the patience of glaciers, knowing that the prey had nowhere to run. Then from above, from the direction of the church, came a sound that broke the spell. The deep, resonant tolling of the iron bell, struck not by human hands but by the wind funneling through the steeple, a pure, low tone that cut through the infrasonic hum like a knife through silk. The creatures hesitated. The bell tolled again, and in the pauses between the strikes Reese heard something else, the voice of Sheriff Dern shouting from the church's doorway, waving a flashlight. "Here! Run, damn you!" The distraction was momentary, a fracture in the pack's concentration, but it was enough. Reese lurched to his feet, the tire iron in his hand, and he charged the nearest creature, not with any hope of harming it but with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. He swung the iron at its foreleg, the metal connecting with a sound like a sledgehammer striking a wooden post, and the creature flinched, not in pain but in surprise, its leg withdrawing for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all Bait needed. She pulled the sisters upright and dragged them past the gap, running toward the church with a speed born of pure adrenaline. Reese followed, his broken ribs screaming with each step, his left arm clutched to his side, the tire iron trailing behind him like a useless talisman. The pack recovered quickly, the hum resuming, but the survivors had gained 20 yards, and then 10, and then they were at the church steps, stumbling up the granite stairs as the heavy oak door swung open and Sheriff Dern's broad hands pulled them inside. The door slammed shut with a concussion that shook the stone walls, and the bar fell into place with the grinding finality of a guillotine blade. They collapsed in the nave, gasping, bleeding, weeping, and Reese lay on the cold flagstones staring up at the vaulted ceiling, his body a constellation of pain that he catalogued with the distant precision of his former profession. 2 ribs fractured, possibly floating, left shoulder dislocated, right knee sprained, multiple lacerations non-life-threatening. He would live perhaps if the walls held. He turned his head and saw Bate cradling Marie's face in her hands, the older woman's eyes wide and unseeing, and Hester lying beside her sister, already dead, her heart having given out during the run, her face peaceful in a way that suggested her end had been a release rather than a defeat. Sheriff Dern stood by the door, his shotgun braced against his shoulder, his face the color of old ash. "How many?" he asked, his voice rough. "At least 3, Bates said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Maybe 4. They're coordinating. They're not just animals, Sheriff, they're something else, something older." Dern nodded, not in agreement but in resignation, as if he had always known that the town would end this way, not in economic decline but in teeth and weight. The church was not empty. Hank Beaudry was there, his bulk huddled in a front pew, his face buried in his hands. 2 other survivors from the town's southern edge, a married couple named Voss who ran the bait shop, sat wrapped in blankets near the altar, their eyes hollow with the shock of having lost their teenage son to the tree line 2 nights prior. There were 8 of them now, 8 souls in a stone box that had become the last redoubt of human habitation in Burden's Hollow. The siege of the church lasted through what remained of the night and into the gray, snow-choked dawn. The creatures did not batter the walls, they knew better. The limestone was too thick, the foundation too solid. Instead they circled, their heavy bodies pressing against the stained glass windows, their claws scraping along the mortar with a sound like knives being sharpened on stone. They made their sounds, the mimicries and the booming hums, and they used them to map the interior, to count the heartbeats, to identify the weak points. The Voss boy, they discovered, had not died in the trees but had been taken alive, and his screams, perfectly replicated, echoed through the ventilation shafts and the gaps in the masonry, driving his mother to madness and causing his father to attempt a suicidal rush at the side door that Sheriff Dern barely prevented. The creatures learned from this, modulating their voices to target specific survivors, using grief as a lever and terror as a wedge. They pressed against the windows until the lead cames bent and the ancient glass cracked, spiderwebbing into patterns that looked like frozen lightning, and through the fractured panes the survivors could see them pacing, their sloped backs rising and falling with each lurching step, their pale eyes glowing like moons in the storm. By midday, the temperature inside the church had dropped to freezing, the hearth having been exhausted of wood, and the survivors huddled together for warmth in the chancel, sharing body heat like shipwrecked sailors on an ice floe. Reese had bound his ribs with strips of cloth torn from the altar linen, and Bate had used her belt to immobilize his shoulder, her fingers lingering on his skin with a tenderness that spoke of unspoken things, of acknowledgments that might never be voiced if the dawn did not bring salvation. They spoke in whispers, their words barely audible over the wind and the scratching. "We can't stay here forever," Reese said. "They'll wait. They have nothing but time. We need to get out, get to the highway, find help." Bates shook her head, her hair matted with sweat and snow. "The highway is 6 miles south through the forest. In this storm, on foot, in our condition, it's impossible." "Then what?" Reese asked. "We wait for the storm to break and then we run," she said. "But we need a route they can't follow, something that uses their size against them." It was Hank Beaudry, of all people, who provided the answer. The farmer, emerging from his catatonia with a slow, grinding clarity, spoke of a passage through the western ridge, a narrow defile in the limestone that the old loggers had called the Needle's Eye. It was a slot canyon, barely 2 feet wide at its narrowest point, formed by a geological fault that had split the ridge during the last ice age. Beaudry had hunted there as a boy, before the forest had reclaimed the trails, and he remembered that the canyon ran for half a mile before opening onto an old logging road that connected, eventually, to the county highway. "Nothing wider than a coyote can get through the eye," he said, his voice thick with the mucus of a man who had not slept in days. "Something the size of what's out there. It'd get stuck like a cork in a bottle." The survivors looked at each other, the idea sparking in their exhausted minds like a match in a gas-filled room. It was a chance. A slim, desperate chance, but a chance nonetheless. The storm began to break in the late afternoon, the wind dropping from a scream to a whisper, the snow thinning to a fine, crystalline dust that glittered in the occasional shafts of weak sunlight that pierced the cloud cover. The creatures seemed to sense the change, their circling growing tighter, their booming calls more frequent, as if they knew that the prey would soon be forced to move. At 4 p.m., with the light failing and the temperature plummeting once more, the survivors made their preparations. They wrapped their feet in strips of curtain and altar cloth, improvising snowshoes that would distribute their weight across the drifts. They armed themselves with what they could find: Dern's shotgun, loaded with the last 4 shells, Beaudry's hunting knife, a blade as long as a man's forearm, the tire iron Reese had carried, and Bates' rifle stock, splintered now but still heavy enough to crack bone. They had no food, no water, no medical supplies beyond Reese's veterinary knowledge and the desperate prayers of the dying. They were 8 souls preparing to run a gauntlet of muscle and appetite, and they knew that not all of them would see the other side. The exodus began at 4:17 p.m., timed to the last toll of the church bell, which Dern struck with a hammer as a distraction. The sound drew the pack to the front of the church, and in that moment the survivors slipped out through a postern door in the rear, a small exit used by the choir that opened onto the church's graveyard and the forest beyond. The snow was hip-deep in the drifts, and the going was agonizingly slow, each step a battle against the clinging white and the sucking cold. They moved in a ragged line, Beaudry in the lead with his knowledge of the terrain, followed by the Voss couple, then the sisters Marie, barely conscious, supported by Bate, then Dern with his shotgun, and finally Reese, bringing up the rear with the tire iron, his broken ribs sending shards of agony through his chest with each breath. The graveyard was a white desert of buried headstones, the crosses and angels reduced to soft, anonymous humps under the snow, and beyond it the forest rose in a wall of black trunks and weighted boughs that seemed to lean forward to receive them. They had covered perhaps 200 yards when the pack realized the deception. The booming calls behind them shifted in timbre, becoming urgent, angry, and the survivors heard the sound of heavy bodies crashing through the underbrush, the lurching gait accelerating into a gallop that shook the earth beneath their feet. Beaudry shouted and pointed, and they saw the entrance to the Needle's Eye ahead, a dark slash in the limestone cliff face, barely visible against the snow. "Run!" Reese screamed, his voice tearing in his throat. "Don't stop!" They ran or tried to run, their improvised snowshoes slipping and tripping, their muscles burning with lactic acid and cold. The Voss couple reached the canyon first, the husband pushing his wife into the gap and then following, their bodies scraping against the rock. Bate dragged Marie forward and Dern turned, raising his shotgun, as the first creature burst from the tree line behind them. It was the largest of the pack, the alpha, its body black with wet snow and streaked with the blood of its kills, its back rising in a ridge that seemed to scrape the low clouds. It saw Dern and it charged, not with the bounding grace of a wolf, but with a rolling, thunderous momentum that pulverized the snow in its path. Dern fired, the shotgun's blast lighting the dusk with a muzzle flash that illuminated the creature in stark relief. The buckshot struck its chest, hundreds of tiny projectiles burying themselves in the dense hide, and the beast flinched, its charge faltering for a single heartbeat. But it did not stop. It lowered its head and rammed into Dern with the full force of its mass, the impact lifting the sheriff off his feet and driving him backward into a granite headstone with a sound like a bag of wet cement dropped from a roof. Dern's body folded around the stone, his spine snapping audibly, his shotgun flying from his hands to land in the snow, unfired. The creature did not pause to crush him further. It simply stepped over the body and continued its pursuit of the fleeing survivors. Reese was the last to reach the canyon. He had hung back, wielding the tire iron with the desperate futility of a man trying to hold back the tide, and he saw Dern die with a clarity that burned the image into his memory forever. The sheriff's eyes wide and surprised, his mouth open in a scream that had no air to voice it, his body bent backward over the stone in a posture that no living spine could achieve. Then the creature was upon him, and Reese threw himself sideways, rolling into the snow as the massive jaws snapped shut on the space where his head had been. He scrambled up, his ribs screaming, his vision edged with black, and he lunged for the canyon mouth. The creature turned, incredibly fast for something so massive, and it lunged after him. But the canyon walls were already pressing against Reese's shoulders, and he squeezed himself into the gap, feeling the stone scrape his cheek and tear his coat. The creature's muzzle slammed into the rock behind him, its teeth snapping inches from his heels, and he felt the hot spray of its breath on his calves, smelled the rot and cedar and blood. It tried to force its head into the gap, the rock groaning under the pressure of its skull, but the needle's eye was barely 18 inches wide, and the creature's shoulders, broad as a truck's fenders, could not follow. It screamed then, a human scream of frustration and rage, Calhoun's voice torn from its throat and thrown against the stone in a wave of sound that made Reese's ears bleed. But it could not reach him. He stumbled deeper into the canyon, the walls pressing closer, the light fading to a dim twilight, and he found the others huddled in a wider chamber 50 yards in. Beaudry was there, and the Voss couple and Bate holding Marie's head in her lap. Of the 8 who had left the church, 6 had reached the needle's eye, but Marie was failing fast, her breath shallow and irregular, her skin the color of candle wax. "She won't make it," Bate said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Her heart. It's given up." Reese knelt beside them, his veterinary instincts overriding his despair, and he checked Marie's pulse, finding it thready and erratic, a bird's wingbeat in the snow. There was nothing he could do, no drug he could administer, no surgery he could perform with his bare hands in a freezing canyon. He held her hand and Bate held the other, and they watched as the old woman's breathing slowed and then stopped, her face relaxing into an expression of peace that was almost a smile. She was the 6th death of the siege, and she would not be the last. Behind them, at the canyon's mouth, the pack had gathered. The survivors could hear them pacing, their claws scraping the rock, their booming calls reverberating through the slot canyon in a distorted, amplified chorus that made the stone seem alive with sound. But the creatures could not enter. The needle's eye was too narrow, and their bulk, their greatest weapon, had become their prison. For now, the survivors were safe. But the canyon was a dead end on 3 sides, and the only way out was forward, through the half-mile of twisting, frozen passage, and then out into the open where the pack waited with the patience of glaciers. The night was falling and the temperature was dropping to lethal levels, and the survivors had no fire, no shelter, and no strength left to run. Reese looked at Bate, at the blood drying on her face and the determination burning in her gray eyes, and he understood that the worst was yet to come. The creatures were not giving up. They were waiting. And the humans, trapped in the stone throat of the earth, were running out of time. The night in the needle's eye was a marathon of suffering that redefined the survivors' understanding of cold. The stone walls, having absorbed the meager warmth of the autumn sun, now radiated a chill that sank into bone marrow and thickened blood into a sluggish syrup. Reese, Bate, Beaudry, and the Voss couple huddled together in the widest chamber of the slot canyon, a space barely 10 feet across and 6 feet high, their bodies pressed into a single mass of shared heat that was still insufficient against the dropping temperature. Marie's body lay in the corner, already stiffening, her face covered with Bates' scarf, because none of them could bear to look at the peace that had settled over her features, a peace that seemed to mock their own desperate clinging to life. They had no fire. Every scrap of wood they had carried was sodden with snow, and the canyon floor was bare stone with only occasional drifts of wind-blown powder. They tore strips from their clothing and wrapped them around their hands and feet, but frostbite was already setting in, the Voss man's fingers turning a waxy white, his wife's toes numb despite the strips of altar cloth. They did not speak. Speech required energy they did not have, and the words would have been swallowed by the continuous, reverberating hum of the pack outside, the booming calls that echoed through the canyon in a distorted, amplified chorus that made the stones seem to breathe with malevolent intent. The creatures had not left. They paced the entrance to the Needle's Eye, their heavy bodies occasionally blocking the pale moonlight that filtered through the slot, casting shadows that stretched and contracted across the canyon walls like a living mural of appetite. At one point, around midnight, the largest of them had attempted to dig. They heard the sound of claws striking granite, a rapid, frenzied scratching that sent sparks cascading into the darkness, and for a terrifying hour it seemed that the creature might succeed in widening the entrance, might break through the ancient stone with the same determination it had applied to the barn and the farmhouse. But the granite was unyielding, a billion-year-old formation that had survived glaciers and earthquakes, and eventually the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic panting that suggested the creature was thinking, planning, calculating new angles of approach. Reese, lying against the cold stone with Bates' head on his chest, listened to that breathing and understood that they were dealing with an intelligence that was not human but was undeniably strategic, a predator that understood cause and effect, that could adapt its tactics to the resistance of its prey. The thought did not comfort him. Dawn came as a gradual brightening of the shadows, the sun rising somewhere beyond the eastern ridge and painting the high walls of the canyon in bands of amber and rose. The temperature remained lethal, but the light restored a fraction of morale, a reminder that the world still turned and that rescue, however improbable, was at least a theoretical possibility. Reese examined the survivors with clinical detachment, his veterinary training asserting itself in the absence of any other framework for action. The Voss man, whose name was Gerald, had second-degree frostbite on 3 fingers, and a laceration on his forehead from the church window that needed stitches he could not provide. His wife, Linda, was hypothermic, her core temperature dangerously low, her movements sluggish and her speech slurred into a monotone that suggested incipient shock. Beaudry was the healthiest of them, his farmer's bulk providing insulation, but his eyes were hollow and his hands shook with a tremor that spoke of psychological fracture, of a man who had seen his livestock crushed and his neighbors devoured, and who no longer believed in the solidity of the world. Bate had sustained a concussion during the flight from Hollowbrook, her pupils uneven, her balance uncertain, but her will remained iron, a rod of determination that kept her upright when her body begged to collapse. Reese himself was a catalogue of injuries, the broken ribs, the dislocated shoulder, a deep laceration on his left thigh that had frozen shut, and a general weakness from blood loss and exposure that made every movement a negotiation with gravity. They could not stay. The canyon was a refuge only in the sense that a coffin is a refuge from the rain. They needed to move, to generate body heat, to reach the logging road that Beaudry remembered from his boyhood. They drank snow, the crystals burning their throats with cold, and they shared the last of their strength in the form of whispered encouragements that rang hollow even to their own ears. Beaudry took the lead, his bulk necessary to break the trail through the deeper snow that had accumulated in the canyon's farther reaches, and they moved in single file, their hands linked like children crossing a dangerous street, their shadows stretching long and thin against the walls. The passage narrowed and widened in irregular intervals, sometimes forcing them to turn sideways and shuffle, other times opening into chambers where they could walk upright. The rock was wet with meltwater that refroze into sheets of black ice, and they slipped and fell with monotonous regularity, each impact sending fresh waves of agony through Reese's ribs and Bates' skull. But they pressed on because behind them at the entrance, the pack still waited, and ahead of them, somewhere in the gray distance, lay the promise of the highway. They had been walking for perhaps an hour when they heard the sound above them. It was not the booming hum of the pack, but a softer, more deliberate scraping, like a heavy body dragging itself across stone. Reese looked up, his neck craning against the canyon walls, and he saw a shadow pass across the strip of sky visible far overhead. The creatures had not been idle during the night. While one group had maintained the vigil at the entrance, others had been searching for alternative routes, and they had found one. A ledge on the canyon's eastern wall, narrow and treacherous, but passable for something with claws and the bulk to break through the occasional choke points. The shadow moved again, and a shower of pebbles and ice cascaded down, striking the survivors with stinging force. "Run!" Reese whispered, and then louder, "Run!" They broke into a shambling jog, their frozen limbs protesting, their balance precarious on the slick stone. Above them, the scraping accelerated, the creature tracking their progress from the heights, and then they heard a sound that froze their blood. The shifting of a massive weight, the grunt of exertion, and the rush of air as something launched itself from the ledge. It did not fall on them directly. The canyon was too narrow for that, the walls too close to allow a clean descent. Instead, the creature landed in a wider chamber 20 yards ahead of them, its body crashing down in a tangle of limbs and snow that blocked the passage with a wall of bristled hide and snapping jaws. It was one of the smaller members of the pack, though smaller was a relative term. It still massed more than a horse, its back rising in a lower ridge but its jaws no less terrible. It had been injured in the leap, its left foreleg bent at an unnatural angle, but the injury did not seem to impair its aggression. It screamed at them, a perfect imitation of Linda Voss's voice calling for her dead son, and then it lunged. Beaudry in the lead did not have time to raise his knife. The creature struck him in the chest with its skull, the impact lifting him off his feet and driving him backward into Gerald Voss, and both men went down in a tangle of limbs and blood. The creature did not bite. It pinned Beaudry with its bulk, the ridge of its back pressing down across the farmer's torso with a sound like a tree trunk splitting in a high wind, and it held him there, grinding, while its jaws snapped at Gerald's face, shearing off his ear and the side of his nose in a single, scissoring bite. Gerald screamed, a high, girlish sound that did not seem to belong to his grizzled frame, and he tried to crawl away, but the creature's hind leg pinned his ankle, the claws digging through his boot and into the bone beneath. Reese and Bate were trapped behind them, the narrow canyon preventing any flanking maneuver. Linda Voss, her hypothermia forgotten in a surge of maternal fury, threw herself at the creature with a rock she had torn from the canyon wall, striking its blind eye with a force that would have stunned any natural animal. The creature turned its head, almost casually, and its jaws closed around her forearm with a pressure that pulverized the radius and ulna into splinters that projected through the skin like snapped twigs. Linda's scream was terrible, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the diaphragm, and the creature shook her once, twice, like a dog with a rat, and then threw her against the canyon wall with a force that cracked her skull and left her hanging in a posture of grotesque repose, her neck broken, her arm dangling by threads of tendon and skin. Gerald, seeing his wife die, found a reserve of strength that bordered on the superhuman. He reached into his jacket and pulled a flare gun, a relic from his bait shop that he had carried out of habit, and he fired it directly into the creature's open mouth. The flare struck the back of the creature's throat with a sound like a torch being plunged into oil, and the beast reared back, its scream becoming a genuine roar of pain and confusion, the fire illuminating the interior of its mouth in a ghastly red light that revealed rows of shearing teeth and a tongue like a slab of raw liver. It thrashed in the narrow space, its injured leg flailing, its body hammering against the canyon walls with impacts that brought down showers of rock and ice. Beaudry, pinned beneath it, was crushed further, his rib cage collapsing with a series of wet pops, his blood spraying upward in a fountain that painted the creature's underside in glistening crimson. Gerald fired again, the second flare striking the creature's shoulder, and the beast, overwhelmed by pain and the confinement of the stone, turned and scrambled back toward the ledge, its claws scrabbling for purchase, its body leaving a trail of smoking saliva and blood. It managed to haul itself up, disappearing over the rim, but they could hear it pacing above, enraged and wounded, waiting for another opportunity. The survivors, reduced now to 3, stood in the slaughterhouse the canyon had become. Beaudry was dead, his body flattened into a shape that no longer resembled a human form, his organs squeezed from him like toothpaste from a tube. Linda hung against the wall, her eyes open and blank. Gerald sat in the snow, his ear gone, his face a mask of blood, the flare gun still smoking in his hand, and he looked at Reese with an expression that was not pleading but simply exhausted, a man who had reached the end of his endurance and found nothing beyond it. "Go," he said, his voice bubbling through the blood in his mouth. "I'm done. I'll hold the passage." "Give me the knife." Reese wanted to argue, to insist that they could carry him, that they could still make it together, but he looked at Gerald's injuries and he knew the truth. The man was bleeding out. His face was half sheared away, his ankle shattered, and the cold was already claiming him, the frostbite advancing up his arms in a purple tide. Reese handed him Beaudry's hunting knife, the blade heavy and sticky with blood, and Gerald took it with a hand that barely had the strength to close. "I'll give you 5 minutes," he said. "Then I'll scream. They'll come to the scream." Reese nodded, his throat too tight for words, and he took Bates' hand and they stepped over Beaudry's remains and they ran. Gerald Voss lasted 7 minutes. They heard him screaming behind them, not in pain but in challenge, a wordless bellow of defiance that echoed through the canyon and was answered by the booming calls of the pack above. Then the screams changed, became wet and rhythmic, and then they stopped. Reese and Bate did not look back. They ran with a desperation that obliterated pain, their feet slipping on the ice, their hands tearing on the rock, their breath coming in ragged gasps that froze in their beards and hair. The canyon began to widen, the walls retreating, and they saw ahead of them the gray light of open sky, the promise of the logging road. But the widening of the canyon meant that the creatures could drop from above without the constriction of the stone, and they heard the scraping accelerate, the pack converging on their position from multiple angles. "There!" Bates shouted, pointing. Ahead of them, the canyon opened onto a narrow defile that Beaudry had described, a passage barely wide enough for a human to pass sideways, a natural bottleneck where the geological fault had pinched the stone into a razor-thin gap. If they could reach it, if they could squeeze through, the creature's broad shoulders would be their undoing. They reached the gap with the sound of pursuit crashing behind them, the heavy bodies of the pack sliding down the canyon walls in controlled avalanches of snow and stone. The gap was everything Beaudry had promised, a vertical slit in the rock, 2 feet wide and 12 feet high, its interior dark and forbidding. Reese pushed Bate into it first, her body scraping against the stone, her coat tearing on the rough edges, and then he followed, his broken ribs screaming as he compressed his chest to fit, his dislocated shoulder grinding in its socket. The gap was 15 yards long, a claustrophobic passage that seemed to tighten with each step, and behind them the first creature slammed into the entrance with a force that shook the mountain. Its head and forelegs fit, but its shoulders, those massive, sloping shoulders built for crushing and pinning, wedged solidly against the stone. It screamed, thrashing, its claws raking the rock in showers of sparks, and its pack mates crashed into it from behind, trying to force it through by sheer mass, the stone groaning under the pressure but holding, the ancient granite unyielding against the modern terror. Reese and Bates squeezed out the far side of the gap and collapsed onto a slope of pine needles and gravel, the logging road visible below them, a ribbon of gray cutting through the snow-choked forest. They had made it. The creatures could not follow, but the pack did not give up. They could hear them still, screaming and booming, and then they heard a new sound. The splintering of wood, the crash of underbrush, the heavy lurching gait taking the long way around, following the base of the ridge, tracking by scent and sound, determined not to lose the prey that had wounded one of their own. "They'll circle," Bait gasped, her face bloody, her eyes wild. "They'll meet us on the road." Reese pulled her up, his body a symphony of agony, and they ran down the slope, their feet finding the gravel of the old road, their minds narrowed to a single luminous thought: the highway. The highway was 2 miles south, 2 miles of open road, exposed and dangerous, but open. They ran. The next 2 hours were a blur of motion and terror, the forest passing in a monochrome rush of black trunks and white snow. They heard the pack paralleling them in the trees, the heavy bodies crashing through the underbrush with a speed that seemed impossible given their bulk, but the road was straight and the going was easier than the canyon, and they made progress. Their lungs burned. Their muscles screamed. Reese's broken ribs sent stabbing pains through his chest with each breath, and Bates' concussion made her stagger, her vision doubling and trebling, but they did not stop. They passed the remains of a vehicle, an old pickup abandoned years ago, its windows shattered, its interior home to a nest of snow and pine needles. They passed a trailhead sign, its paint peeled, its message illegible. And finally, as the sun reached its zenith and the storm clouds began to break apart like a defeated army, they heard it. The sound of tires on wet pavement, the distant hum of a diesel engine, the unmistakable, beautiful drone of human civilization. They stumbled out of the tree line onto the shoulder of Highway 41, a 2-lane blacktop that connected Burden's Hollow to the rest of the Upper Peninsula. A semi-truck was approaching from the south, its cab a red slash against the white landscape, and Reese stepped into the road, waving his arms, his voice too hoarse to shout, his body a totem of blood and frostbite and despair. The truck slowed, the driver a grizzled man in a flannel jacket who looked at them with an expression that shifted from annoyance to shock to horror as he took in their condition. He stopped. He opened the door, and Reese and Bate climbed into the cab, into the warmth and the smell of coffee and diesel and human sweat, and they collapsed against the seat, their bodies shaking with sobs that they had not known they were capable of producing. The driver asked questions. Where had they come from? What had happened? Was anyone else out there? Reese tried to answer, but the words came out as gibberish, a slurred amalgamation of creature and weight and crushed that made the driver exchange a glance with Bate, who could only shake her head and whisper, "Drive. Please, just drive." The driver, perhaps sensing the depth of their trauma, or perhaps simply unwilling to spend another minute in the silence of that particular stretch of forest, put the truck in gear and accelerated south. The cab rocked with the motion, the heater blasting against their frozen skin, and Reese felt consciousness beginning to fray, the edges of his awareness softening into a darkness that promised rest. He looked at Bate. She was looking out the passenger window, her face turned toward the receding tree line, her expression unreadable. He followed her gaze. The forest was quiet, the snow lay undisturbed. There was no sign of pursuit, no massive shapes in the trees, no booming hum to vibrate the windows. They were safe. They had survived. The weight of the slope was behind them. The driver turned on the radio, seeking a weather report or a news station, and the static crackled and popped in the cab's speakers. Reese closed his eyes. He thought of Beaudry's barn, of Dern's body bent over the gravestone, of Gerald Voss's final scream. He thought of the creature's breath on his calves in the needle's eye, of the way its weight had felt like a geological event, like gravity itself had become malevolent. He thought of the physics of it, the mass and the pressure and the terrible, patient intelligence that had turned a town into a slaughterhouse. And then, just as sleep was about to claim him, Bates' hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his own, and she squeezed. He opened his eyes. She was still looking out the window, but her body had gone rigid, her breath held, her pulse visible in the artery of her neck. Reese turned. Through the rear window of the cab, through the clearing storm and the retreating miles of white pine and cedar, something was moving, not running, pacing. A dark shape on the ridge of the road, visible only in silhouette against the snow, moving with that heavy, sloped, rhythmic lurch that had haunted their every step since Hollowbrook. And then it stopped. It raised its head, and from its throat issued a sound that was not the wind and not the tires and not the radio static. It was a scream, a human scream, a perfect, ear-splitting replication of Bate Crenshaw's own voice, calling Reese's name from the darkness behind them. They did not look back. They did not speak. They simply held each other's hands with a grip that would leave bruises for weeks, and they waited for the driver to reach the next town, the next light, the next sanctuary where the weight of the slope could not reach them. But in the silence of the cab, beneath the rumble of the engine and the whisper of the heater, they could both hear it, faint but unmistakable, the patient booming hum that matched the rhythm of their own terrified hearts. The Shunka Warak'in did not forget a scent once it had tasted it. It did not abandon territory once it had claimed it. And the highway, for all its asphalt and its diesel and its human noise, was still part of the forest. The slope was patient. The slope was heavy. And the slope would wait for them to make the mistake of stopping, of breathing too loudly, of thinking they were safe. They did not look back. But they knew, with a certainty that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives, that the weight was still there, pacing the ridgeline, mapping their pulse, and that one day, when the snow fell again and the roads grew quiet, the absence would return and the crushing would begin anew. The boot on the rock. The rotors hummed at a frequency that should have been soothing, a mechanical lullaby pitched to cancel the lower registers of anxiety. But Dr. Helena Voss felt no comfort as she stared at the monitor feed from the Mavic drone, currently hovering at 300 meters above the Emerald Valley. The screen showed a landscape of such pristine, almost aggressive beauty that it seemed to resist human interpretation. A bowl of rainforest pressed between limestone ridges in a remote sector of the Northern Territory, where the map still read unsurveyed, and the satellite imagery dated to the early 90s. The valley was a single, uninterrupted carpet of emerald green, a tone so saturated it appeared digital, broken only by the silver thread of a seasonal creek that wound through its center like a vein of mercury. And in the center of the frame, placed with a deliberation that made Helena's stomach clench like a fist, was the boot. It was a single, massive, blood-soaked leather boot, the kind worn by cattlemen and rangers, size 14 at least, and it stood upright on a flat-topped boulder at the creek's edge as if its owner had stepped out of it and vanished into the air. But the owner had not vanished. A human hand, skinned at the wrist but still identifiable by the wedding ring on the third finger, protruded from the boot's opening, gripping the laces from the inside with a rigor mortis stiffness that suggested the limb had been inserted post-mortem, or perhaps during the final moments of life, by forces that understood the language of symbolism. Helena watched the feed in silence, her finger hovering over the record button, her other hand adjusting the drone's altitude with a tremor she could not control. In the background of the frame, beyond the boot and the boulder and the creek, something massive and scaly shifted the foliage. She saw it only as a displacement of leaves, a wave in the canopy that moved against the wind, a suggestion of scale that her rational mind refused to quantify. She thumbed the joystick, trying to pivot the drone for a better angle, but the object, whatever it was, remained peripheral, never fully entering the frame, never granting her the relief of certainty, only the horror of implication. The rotors hummed, the hand gripped the laces, and the valley, for all its emerald peace, breathed with a hunger that the monitor could not filter. 3 weeks earlier, the Containment Outpost had been established with the cheerful optimism of a scientific expedition that mistook isolation for control. Helena had assembled her team in Darwin, briefing them in a conference room that smelled of instant coffee and the particular mildew endemic to tropical air conditioning. She was 43 years old, a professor of environmental biology at the University of Queensland, with a specialty in apex predator ecology and a reputation for fearlessness that bordered on recklessness. She had studied lion prides in the Serengeti, tracked tiger sharks along the Great Barrier Reef, and once spent 6 months in the Amazon documenting the hunting patterns of giant otters. She believed, with the fervor of a convert, that there was no ecosystem on Earth that could not be understood, catalogued, and ultimately managed by the application of rigorous empirical method. Her team reflected this faith in technology. Marcus Chen, a 32-year-old engineer from Brisbane who had designed the sensor arrays and thermal cameras that would form the outpost's electronic perimeter. Dave Coulter, a former Army Ranger turned security contractor who carried his cynicism like a sidearm. And Jura Tjungare, a local tracker whose recruitment Helena had initially resisted, but whose knowledge of the land had proven indispensable in navigating the unmapped sectors of the Arnhem Land Plateau. They were 12 in total, including graduate students, a documentary filmmaker named Petra who had secured funding from a streaming service, and a rotating cast of local laborers who helped haul equipment and build the prefabricated shelters that comprised their base. The outpost itself sat in a clearing on the eastern edge of the valley, a collection of modular structures that looked like lunar habitats dropped into a jungle painting. There was the command center, a climate-controlled box of aluminum and polycarbonate where the monitors glowed 24 hours a day. The dormitory, a long, low structure with bunks stacked 3 high. The lab, stocked with preservatives and sampling equipment. And the tower, a 60-foot scaffold of galvanized steel that rose above the canopy and provided a panoramic view of the surrounding terrain. They had cleared 2 acres of understory, a concession to the local ecology that Helena had justified as minimal impact. And they had ringed the perimeter with motion sensors and electric fencing that pulsed with a current strong enough to deter a water buffalo. They believed they were the hunters. They believed that the anomaly they had come to study, a localized collapse in the predator population that had left the valley strangely devoid of large carnivores, was a puzzle to be solved, a riddle of disease or migration or microclimate that would yield to the proper application of data. They were wrong. They were not the hunters. They were the census, and the census was about to be taken. The first week had been uneventful in the way that tropical fieldwork is always uneventful, which is to say that it was a continuous assault of humidity, insect bites, and equipment failures that required constant improvisation. Helena spent her days coordinating the placement of camera traps along the valley's game trails, while Marcus calibrated the thermal imagers and Petra filmed establishing shots of the team looking purposeful against the backdrop of the forest. Jura moved through the bush with a silence that seemed to embarrass the other team members, his bare feet finding purchase on rocks and roots that sent the others sprawling, his eyes constantly scanning the canopy, with an expression that Helena had initially interpreted as mysticism, but was beginning to recognize as vigilance. He spoke little, and when he did, his English was precise but heavily accented, carrying the cadences of his native language like a subtext that refused translation. On the 4th day, as they were returning from a trail camera installation, he had stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared into the trees for a long moment, his head tilted in a posture of listening that Helena had seen before in big cat researchers tracking lion roars. "The birds," he said. "Listen." Helena had listened. The forest was loud with the usual cacophony of the wet season, cicadas, frogs, the rustle of leaves in the afternoon convection currents. But Jura was right. There were no birds, no parrots screeching, no honeyeaters calling, no pigeons bursting from the underbrush in explosions of gray wings. The avian layer of the soundscape had been erased, leaving a frequency band that was empty in a way that felt less like absence and more like avoidance. "They've moved on," Helena had said, making a note in her field book. "Seasonal shift, We'll adjust the survey parameters." Jura had looked at her with an expression that might have been pity, and he had shaken his head. "Not shifted," he said. "Gone, everything gone. The valley is holding its breath." She had dismissed it. That was her first mistake, though in the long accounting of errors that would follow it would seem minor, almost forgivable. She was a scientist, and science demanded falsifiable hypotheses, not the poetic intuitions of trackers. But the intuition was correct. By the end of the first week, the mammals had vanished as well. The camera traps, which had initially captured abundant footage of wallabies, kangaroos, and the occasional feral pig, began to return empty frames, the infrared sensors triggered by nothing but the sway of vines and the passage of wind. The scat surveys turned up nothing fresh, only desiccated pellets that crumbled to dust when touched, suggesting that the animals had evacuated the area weeks before the team's arrival. Even the insects seemed diminished, the mosquito clouds that had plagued them during the first days thinning to a scattered few that could be swatted rather than endured. The valley was emptying itself, not gradually but in a rush, as if the entire biomass had received a single, collective telegram advising immediate departure. Marcus ran the data through his laptops, searching for patterns in temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, but the variables refused to correlate. There was no flood coming, no fire, no disease vector that their traps could detect. The forest was simply becoming a void, and they were standing in the center of it. The second week brought the silence. It was not the silence of a library or a church, those human constructions that still contained the subliminal hum of electricity and blood flow. It was the silence of a vacuum, a negative pressure that seemed to pull at the eardrums and create phantom sounds in its place. Helena noticed it first in the command center, late at night, when she was reviewing footage alone and became aware that the background static of the forest, the cricket orchestras, the dripping condensation, the creak of boughs, had ceased entirely. The monitors still showed the green night vision feed from the perimeter cameras, but the audio was dead, a flat line of digital silence that made her want to clear her throat just to prove that sound still existed. She mentioned it to Dave the next morning, expecting his usual gruff dismissal, but the security contractor surprised her by nodding, his face uncharacteristically pale beneath his tan. "Yeah," he said. "I heard it too, or didn't hear it, I guess. My ears are ringing like I just left a concert, and I keep feeling sick, like seasick, but I'm on dry land." Helena felt it too now that he named it. A nausea that had nothing to do with the food or the heat, a queasiness that rose from the diaphragm and seemed to resonate in the sternum, as if her ribs were being used as a tuning fork by some external source. She checked her pulse. 62. Normal, but her heart felt wrong, each beat arriving late, as if delayed by a signal interference she could not locate. It was Jura who provided the explanation, though he offered it reluctantly, as a man might offer a dangerous tool to a child. "Burrunjor," he said, sitting by the fire pit on the evening of the 9th day, his eyes reflecting the flames in a way that made them seem to glow from within. "The old people talk about it, not a story for tourists, not a story for scientists. It is a law of the land. When the Burrunjor wakes, everything else goes quiet. The birds know, the kangaroos know, they leave before it gets hungry." Helena had leaned forward, her recorder in her hand, her academic instincts overriding her unease. "Describe it," she said. Jura had been silent for a long time, staring into the fire as if reading something in the embers. "It is not a crocodile," he said finally. "Not a lizard, not a snake. It is older. It walks on two legs like a man, but it is not a man. It is 20 feet long, maybe more. It has 3 toes, claws like a goanna but big as a shovel. And it calls with a sound that does not enter the ears. It enters the body. It makes the heart shake." He had placed his hand on his chest, demonstrating. "Like this, boom, 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 the booming. When you hear it, you know you are already inside its territory. And inside its territory there is only one law: it eats or you leave." Helena had recorded the words, but she had not believed them. She had attributed them to folklore, to the projection of cultural narratives onto the anxiety of an empty forest. She had been wrong. The booming began on the 10th day. It arrived not as a sound but as a sensation, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to originate in the earth itself and travel upward through the soles of their boots, through the legs, through the pelvis, to lodge in the chest cavity like a swallowed stone. Helena was in the lab when it hit, sorting soil samples by the light of a headlamp, and she dropped a Petri dish that shattered on the concrete floor. The vibration was rhythmic, pulsing at a rate of approximately 40 beats per minute, far below the threshold of human hearing, but precisely calibrated to interfere with cardiac function. She felt her own heart attempt to synchronize with it, her pulse slowing against her will, each beat becoming heavier, more labored, as if her blood had thickened to the consistency of syrup. Around her, the team was experiencing the same effect. Marcus clutched the doorframe, his face greenish in the fluorescent light, muttering about a gas leak or a seismic event. Dave had drawn his sidearm and was standing in the center of the compound, turning in slow circles, his eyes wide and unfocused, the weapon shaking in his grip. The graduate students had retreated to their bunks, vomiting into buckets, their bodies reacting to the infrasound with a biological panic that predated conscious thought. Only Jura seemed unaffected, or rather, he seemed prepared, his face set in a mask of grim fatalism as he gathered his spear and his kit and moved toward the tower. "It is measuring us," he said to Helena as he passed. "The booming tells it how many hearts are beating, where they are, how fast they run." The first casualty occurred during a routine perimeter check on the morning of the 11th day. His name was Brendan Akers, a 26-year-old graduate student from Melbourne who had specialized in herpetology and who had joined the expedition because he thought the ecological anomaly might be linked to a disease affecting monitor lizards. He had volunteered for the Dawn Tower Watch, a 4-hour shift of scanning the perimeter with binoculars and thermal imagers, and he had climbed the 60-foot scaffold with the easy confidence of a man who had grown up scrambling around construction sites. The tower was equipped with a safety cage around its observation platform, a framework of welded steel bars that rose to chest height, and was topped with a corrugated roof that provided shade and protection from the tropical downpours. It was considered the safest position in the outpost, removed from the ground, surrounded by sensors, visible to the command center via a fixed camera. Brendan had waved to Petra as she passed below, carrying coffee to the lab, and he had settled into his chair with a pair of binoculars and a notepad. The last transmission from his radio, recorded at 6:23 a.m., was a casual comment about the fog lifting from the valley floor. At 6:31, the tower's camera recorded a blur. At 6:32, the radio transmitted a sound that the automatic transcription software later rendered as "Oh God, it's," and then static. By 6:35, when Marcus reached the tower's base in response to the alarm, Brendan was gone. They found his binoculars first, lying in the dirt 20 yards from the tower's base, the lenses cracked, the strap snapped as if torn by a sudden, violent motion. Then they found his notepad, its pages scattered by the wind, the last entry a sketch of something in the fog that looked like a tree trunk but was labeled in Brendan's neat handwriting, "Leg." Then they found the blood, a spray pattern on the tower's corrugated wall that began 8 feet from the ground and extended upward in a vertical smear that terminated at the platform's edge. But the platform was intact. The safety cage was intact. The roof was intact. There was no sign of forced entry, no bent bars, no claw marks on the steel. It was as if something had simply reached up from the ground and plucked Brendan from his perch like a fruit from a low-hanging branch. But the tower was 60 feet high. The platform was accessible only by ladder, and the ladder was intact, its rungs undisturbed. Helena stared at the blood spray and felt the foundations of her scientific certainty begin to crack like lake ice in spring. "Show me the footage," she said, and Marcus, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate the console, cued the tower camera's recording. The video was grainy, distorted by the morning fog and the low angle of the sun, but it was clear enough to destroy sleep. At 6:31:14, the frame showed Brendan standing at the cage, his binoculars raised, his body relaxed. At 6:31:17, a shadow fell across the platform from above, a shape that blocked the sun with a wingspan that made no sense, a mass that moved with a ponderous, drifting motion like a cloud. At 6:31:19, Brendan lowered the binoculars and turned, his mouth opening in an expression of surprise rather than fear. At 6:31:20, something entered the frame from the top of the cage, something that was not a claw or a beak but a hand, a massive, scaly, three-fingered hand that gripped the roof's edge, and then, with a fluid economy of motion, reached down and closed around Brendan's torso. The cage did not break. The bars did not bend. The hand simply reached through the gap between the roof and the top rail, a gap of 8 inches, and wrapped around the young man's chest and shoulders with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge, an understanding of where to grip to prevent struggle. Brendan was lifted straight up, his legs kicking in a spastic dance that lasted less than 2 seconds, and then he was gone, pulled over the roof and out of the frame, leaving only the blood spray that the camera recorded in the next frame as it arced across the corrugated wall. The entire event had taken 4 seconds. The hand had never been fully visible. The body of the creature had never entered the frame. Only the hand, the shadow, and the absence. They stood in silence around the monitor, the team reduced to a tableau of shock that would have seemed comedic in any other context. Dave was the first to speak, his voice a rasp that barely carried. "That was no crocodile," he said. "Crocs don't have hands. They don't reach. They don't pluck." Helena said nothing. She was staring at the frozen frame, at the hand gripping the roof, and she was trying to calculate the musculature required to lift a 170-pound man from a 60-foot tower with one arm. The physics were absurd. The leverage was impossible. The creature, whatever it was, would need to be not merely strong but engineered, built according to principles that did not appear in any textbook she had ever read. And then she noticed something else, a detail that had escaped her in the shock of the main event. The hand had 3 fingers. Each finger ended in a claw that was not curved like a predator's talon but flattened and broad, like a digging tool. And the skin, visible in the high-contrast freeze frame, was not smooth like a reptile's but textured with a pattern of raised scales that overlapped like feathers, like the bristles of a bird, a plumage of keratin that would provide insulation and sensory input. She thought of Jura's description, the feather-like bristles that he had mentioned in passing, and a cold certainty formed in her gut. They were not dealing with a known species. They were not dealing with a mutation or a disease. They were dealing with a biological impossibility that had somehow survived in this valley, hidden from science and civilization, until their arrogance had disturbed its sleep. They found the footprint later that afternoon, pressed into the red clay at the base of the tower with a depth that suggested a multi-ton organism. It was not a track in the conventional sense. It was a crater, a depression 3 feet across and 18 inches deep, shaped like the print of a gigantic bird or a theropod dinosaur, 3 splayed toes terminating in gouges that had scraped the subsoil down to the bedrock. But the toes were not the spatulate digits of a theropod. They were narrow, elongated, with joints that suggested an opposable grip, and the spacing between the prints indicated a stride length of 12 feet, a bipedal gait that covered ground with a speed that no animal of comparable mass should have been able to achieve. Marcus measured it with a tape and photographed it from 12 angles, his face pale, his hands trembling so violently that he had to use a tripod to keep the camera steady. "This is a joke," he kept saying, as if repetition would make it true. "This has to be a joke. Someone built this. It's a sculpture. It's a hoax." Helena knelt beside the print and touched the clay. It was still warm, retaining the heat of the massive body that had pressed it, and the edges were sharp, undisturbed by wind or rain, suggesting that the creature had passed this way within the last few hours. She brought her fingers to her nose. The clay smelled of sulfur and iron and something else, something organic and ancient, a musk that made her think of deep caves and the rot of millennia. She stood up and looked at the tree line, at the wall of green that surrounded their clearing like a curtain, and she understood with a clarity that made her knees weak that the curtain was about to open, and the thing behind it was not a miracle of evolution but a nightmare of persistence. They returned to the outpost in a silence that was not the silence of the forest, but the silence of a jury delivering a verdict. They knew now. They knew that Brendan had not been taken by a crocodile or a python or a feral pig. He had been taken by something that could reach 60 feet into the air, something that could lift a grown man with one hand, something that left footprints 2 feet wide and walked on 2 legs with a stride that covered 12 feet. The realization hit them not as a single blow, but as a series of implications, each one more terrible than the last. If the creature was bipedal and 25 feet long, it was not an aberration but an apex predator of a scale that had not existed on Earth since the Cretaceous. If it had remained hidden in this valley, it was because it was intelligent enough to avoid detection, patient enough to wait out intruders, territorial enough to eliminate competition. And if it had begun hunting them, it was because they had violated some boundary, some protocol of coexistence that they had not known existed. They were not scientists anymore. They were trespassers, and the land was evicting them. Helena called an emergency meeting in the command center. The team crowded around the monitors like survivors around a dying fire. She laid out the facts with a precision that she did not feel, her voice steady, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their shaking. They would evacuate, she said. They would pack the essential equipment, disable the non-portable gear, and drive out in the 2 all-terrain vehicles that had carried them from the nearest road, 40 miles to the east. They would not attempt to document the creature further. They would not try to trap it or study it or understand it. They would leave and they would report their findings to the authorities, and they would let professionals deal with the nightmare they had uncovered. It was the only rational course of action, and she expected relief, even gratitude, from her team. Instead, she saw fear deepen into terror. Marcus looked at her with eyes that seemed to have receded into his skull. "The trucks," he said. "Have you checked the trucks?" Helena had not. She had assumed that the vehicles, parked in the clearing's designated motor pool and protected by the electric fence, would be unaffected by the events of the morning. She assumed wrong. The trucks were destroyed, not vandalized, not disabled by mechanical failure, destroyed with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of internal combustion engines. The oil pans of both vehicles had been crushed from beneath, the metal punctured by something that had levered up from the ground with enough force to drive the steel into the crankcases, releasing the lubricant in black pools that had soaked into the red clay. The radiators had been stove in, their aluminum fins crumpled like tissue paper, the coolant lines severed with clean, surgical cuts that could not have been made by claws but suggested the application of a tool, or perhaps a nail sharpened to a chisel's edge. The tires had not been slashed but pulled, the rubber torn from the rims in strips that hung like the petals of a metallic flower. And on the hood of the lead vehicle, scratched into the paint with a force that had exposed the bare steel beneath, were 3 parallel gouges that matched the spacing of the toes in the print at the tower's base. The creature had sabotaged their escape. It had studied their machines, understood their vulnerabilities, and eliminated them with a strategic intelligence that was not merely animal but tactical. Helena stared at the ruined trucks and felt the first true thread of despair unspool in her chest. They were not being hunted by a beast. They were being besieged by a general. Dave had gone to the armory, a locked locker in the command center that contained the expedition's permitted firearms, 2 bolt-action rifles, a shotgun, and a flare pistol. He distributed them with the grim efficiency of a man preparing for a last stand, his movements mechanical, his eyes fixed on some middle distance where his training had taught him to project the enemy. "We fortify," he said. We hold the compound. We radio for help. But the radio was dead, its antenna sheared off by something that had climbed the command center's roof during the night, leaving only twisted aluminum and a smear of the same sulfurous musk that had marked the footprint. The satellite phones could not lock onto a signal, the dense canopy and the limestone ridges creating a dead zone that isolated them completely. They were 40 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by a forest that had been emptied of everything but the creature, and their only means of transport had been reduced to scrap. Dave's face, as he absorbed this information, underwent a transformation that Helena would remember for the rest of her life. The hardened mask of the professional soldier cracking to reveal the child beneath, the small, frightened boy who had believed that weapons and walls could keep the dark at bay. The attrition had begun. The creature did not attack the compound directly. It did not need to. It had already demonstrated that the tower was not safe, that the fence was not a barrier, that the machines were not escape. Now it began to demonstrate that the forest itself was hostile, that every shadow concealed a threat, that the very geography of the valley had become an instrument of their destruction. Petra, the filmmaker, was the first to experience the spatial invalidity of the creature's hunting method. She had gone to retrieve memory cards from a camera trap set 200 yards down the eastern trail, armed with a handheld GPS and Dave's shouted warnings ringing in her ears. She had walked the trail a dozen times before, knew every bend and route, and she moved with the quiet confidence of familiarity. But on this morning, the trail had changed. The landmarks were the same, but their relationships had shifted, the distances between them elongated or compressed in a way that made her doubt her own memory. She felt the creature's breath on her neck, a warm, humid exhalation that smelled of sulfur and iron, and she spun around, raising the camera like a shield. But there was nothing there, only the empty trail and the waiting trees. She turned back to continue, and there it was, 20 feet behind her, standing in the center of the trail with a stillness that was more terrible than motion. It was partially obscured by the brush, but she saw enough. The scale, the feathered bristles, the three-toed feet planted in the clay like pillars, the head raised on a neck that curved like a question mark, the eyes, small and yellow and fixed upon her with an intensity that was not hunger but assessment. She did not scream. She could not. Her diaphragm had locked, her lungs frozen, her body refusing the command to flee because some deeper instinct understood that flight was exactly what the creature wanted, that the chase was part of the pleasure. She backed away, step by step, her eyes never leaving the yellow orbs, and the creature let her go, watching her retreat with a patience that was worse than attack, a confidence that suggested it knew she would be back, that all paths led eventually to its jaws. She reached the compound in a state of cataleptic shock, her camera clutched to her chest, the memory card forgotten in the trap. She never spoke again. They sedated her, placed her in a bunk, and listened to her whimper in her sleep, the sound of a mind that had retreated to a place the creature could not follow, at least not yet. Helena stood in the command center, surrounded by the wreckage of their scientific mission, and she understood that the expedition was over, not postponed, not disrupted, over. They were no longer researchers. They were survivors, and the creature was not a subject but an executioner. She looked at the map of the valley pinned to the wall, at the contour lines that described a terrain of ridges and gullies and limestone formations, and she searched for a way out, a route that would avoid the creature's territory, a passage that would lead them to safety. The valley was bounded on 3 sides by steep escarpments, impassable without climbing gear they did not possess. The 4th side, the eastern approach, was the way they had come, but it was 40 miles of dense scrub and the creature's patrols. There was no easy escape. There was no escape at all, unless they could find a terrain feature that neutralized the creature's advantages, a place where its size and strength became liabilities rather than assets. Her finger traced the contour lines, following the seasonal creek as it cut through the valley's center, and she found what she was looking for. A limestone gorge, 3 miles to the south, where the creek had carved a passage through the ridge in a series of narrow defiles and sinkholes. The map labeled it Narrows in small print, and the contour lines showed walls that rose sheer on both sides, the passage pinching to less than 6 feet in places. If they could reach it, if they could navigate it, the creature's 25-foot length and broad shoulders would be a disadvantage. It would have to climb or go around, and in the time that bought them, they might reach the railway siding that Marcus had spotted on the satellite imagery, a disused track that ran along the eastern escarpment and connected, eventually, to the main line. It was a desperate plan, dependent on terrain they had never surveyed and a creature they did not understand, but it was the only plan they had. Helena turned to the survivors and spoke with a conviction she did not feel. "We leave at dawn," she said. "We travel light. We stay together. And we do not stop for anything." Outside, the booming began again, a low-frequency pulse that vibrated in their chests and synchronized their heartbeats to a rhythm that was not their own. And in the darkness between the trees, something massive and scaly shifted its weight and waited for them to run. Dawn in the valley was not a sunrise but a seepage, a gradual brightening of the fog that turned the world into a watercolor painting of greens and grays without definition or depth. The survivors gathered at the compound's eastern gate with the tense, brittle coordination of a bomb squad handling an unstable device, their packs stripped to essentials, their weapons clutched in white-knuckled grips that had forgotten the distinction between readiness and desperation. Helena had divided them into a formation that she hoped would maximize their chances. Jura in the lead, his tracker instincts their only reliable compass through the unmarked scrub. Dave immediately behind, his rifle loaded with the last of the buckshot. Helena and Marcus in the center, supporting Petra between them, the filmmaker having emerged from her sedation in a state of walking catatonia that made her limbs heavy and her responses delayed, and a graduate student named Tom Okonkwo bringing up the rear with a machete and a handheld radio that emitted only static. They had water, a day's rations, a first aid kit depleted by Brendan's disappearance and Petra's breakdown, and the desperate, half-formed hope that the creature would not expect them to move in daylight, that its nocturnal habits would grant them a head start. It was a thin hope, and Helena knew it. She had seen the footage. The creature had taken Brendan at dawn. The darkness was not its limitation, it was merely its preference. They moved in silence, or what passed for silence in a rainforest. The wet crunch of boots on leaf litter, the rasp of breathing through mouths held open to listen, the occasional cry of a parrot that seemed to mock their fear with its indifference. Juras at a pace that was brutal but necessary, his bare feet finding purchase on rocks and roots that sent the others slipping, his head constantly turning, his nostrils flaring as he sampled the air for the sulphurous musk that would signal the creature's proximity. They followed the seasonal creek southward, staying within the cover of the riparian vegetation, the dense tangle of paperbarks and ferns that provided concealment, but also restricted their vision to a few meters in any direction. The creek was low, its bed a mosaic of cracked mud and stagnant pools that smelled of decay, and Helena found herself watching the water with an irrational terror, half expecting to see the creature's reflection rising from the depths like a nightmare in a mirror. But the water was empty. The forest was empty. The absence of wildlife that had characterized their first days had now become absolute, a vacuum in which their own sounds seemed amplified to the point of betrayal, each snapped twig a gunshot, each cough a beacon. They had covered perhaps a mile when the spatial invalidity began. It started as a pressure at the base of the skull, a sensation of being watched that had no directional source, and then it manifested as physical symptoms. Dave, marching with his shotgun at port arms, felt a warm exhalation brush the nape of his neck, the distinct sensation of breath, moist and sulphurous, that made him spin around with his weapon raised, finger tightening on the trigger. But there was nothing behind them, Only the empty trail, the creek, the waiting trees. "It's there," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I felt it. It's right behind me." Helena looked back. The trail was clear for 50 meters and then it curved behind a stand of melaleuca. Nothing moved. But Dave's face was the color of chalk, his eyes wide with a terror that did not match the visual evidence. "It's not behind you," Jura said, his voice low and certain. "It's beside you. It moves through the scrub. It knows how to bend the light." Helena wanted to dismiss this as superstition, but then she felt it too. A presence to her left, massive and patient, separated from her by only a few meters of foliage. She turned, her heart hammering, and for a fraction of a second she saw it. A patch of scales, feathered and iridescent, shifting behind a curtain of vines, and then a yellow eye fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate her skin and read the temperature of her blood. She blinked. The eye was gone. The scales were gone. But when she looked back at Dave, she saw that he had turned to face the same direction, his shotgun tracking a target that was no longer visible, his whole body shaking with the effort of not firing into the empty green. The creature was flanking them. It was not hunting them in a straight line but in a spiral, moving through the dense scrub with a speed that defied its bulk, using the terrain to break sightlines and distort perception. It would appear at the edge of vision, a suggestion of scale and movement, and then it would be somewhere else, 20 feet behind or 30 feet ahead, always peripheral, never central, a predator that understood the psychology of pursuit better than any human strategist. Petra whimpered, her feet dragging, her eyes rolling in a way that suggested she was seeing things the others could not. "It's in the trees," she mumbled, her voice slurred. "It's walking on the branches. I can hear its claws on the bark." Helena listened. She heard nothing but the wind. But then beneath the wind she caught a sound that did not belong, a slow, deliberate creaking like a tree trunk being bent by a massive weight, followed by the snap of a branch that was too thick to break under any ordinary load. She looked up. The canopy, 50 meters overhead, was a dense weave of interlocking branches and leaves, impenetrable to light. But something was moving up there. Something was traveling through the canopy with a ponderous, swaying motion, using the branches as a highway, its weight bending the boughs until they cracked and splintered, dropping debris in a continuous rain of twigs and leaves that pattered around the survivors like warning shots. "Move!" Jura shouted, breaking into a run. The formation dissolved into a panic-stricken scramble, Petra dragged between Helena and Marcus, Tom stumbling in the rear, his machete raised against enemies he could not see. They ran without direction, without purpose, their only goal the creation of distance, and the creature let them run. It did not pursue immediately. It let them exhaust themselves, let them scatter their reserves of energy across the uneven terrain, let them believe that flight was possible. Then, when they had covered perhaps 200 meters and their lungs were burning and their legs were leaden, it struck. Not from above, as they expected, but from the side, from the creek bed itself. Tom had fallen behind, his asthma triggered by the exertion, and he had stopped at the edge of a shallow pool to gulp air and listen for pursuit. He was a cautious man, a methodical researcher who had joined the expedition because he believed in the sanctity of data, and his first instinct when he heard the booming begin was to hide. He looked at the creek, at the shallow water and the overhanging bank, and he saw a refuge. He waded into the pool, his boots sinking into the mud, and he pressed himself against the undercut, pulling ferns across his body, making himself small, making himself invisible. The booming grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that vibrated the water around him, sending ripples across the surface in concentric circles that matched the frequency of his own faltering heartbeat. He held his breath. The water was cold, leaching the heat from his limbs, but he did not move. He was hidden. He was safe. The creature did not see him. It did not need to. It simply stepped onto the bank above the pool, its three-toed foot pressing down with a mass measured in tons, and the earth, already saturated by the wet season, collapsed. The bank gave way in a single fluid motion, a wall of mud and roots and stone that fell like a curtain, burying Tom beneath tons of debris in an instant. He had time for one scream, a sound that was cut off by the wet impact of the earth, and then he was gone, his body folded into the mud, his lungs filled with clay, his hiding place become his grave. The creature stood on the collapsed bank, its weight holding the earth in place, and it waited, listening for movement beneath the slide. When none came, it moved on, leaving the depression in the mud that would become Tom's only memorial. The survivors, hearing the collapse and the truncated scream, doubled their pace, but they did not turn back. They knew what they would find. They knew that the creature was not merely hunting them but herding them, using the terrain as a fence, driving them toward a destination of its own choosing. By mid-morning, they had reached the limestone gorge. It announced itself not gradually, but as a geological fault line, the forest parting to reveal a slash in the earth where the creek had carved a passage through the ridge. The walls rose sheer on both sides, gray and striated, pocked with solution holes and the twisted roots of fig trees that had found purchase in the cracks. The floor of the gorge was a jumble of fallen boulders and scree, the creek reduced to a trickle that threaded between the stones like a silver thread. It was a beautiful place, in the abstract way that a knife is beautiful, all clean lines and deadly function, and Helena felt a surge of hope as she recognized it from the map. The Narrows. The passage that would neutralize the creature's size. She urged the survivors forward, her voice rough with dehydration and fear, and they entered the gorge with a sense of crossing a threshold, of leaving one domain for another where the rules might be different. The walls closed in gradually, the gorge narrowing from 20 meters to 10, then to 5, the sky above reduced to a ribbon of blue between the overhanging ledges. The temperature dropped, the stone radiating a chill that countered the tropical humidity, and their breath plumed in the shadows. They moved carefully, climbing over boulders, squeezing through gaps, their packs scraping the rock on both sides. Petra had recovered enough to walk on her own, though her eyes remained unfocused and her hands trembled. Marcus led the way now, his engineering mind assessing the structural stability of the passage, searching for choke points where the creature might be blocked. Dave brought up the rear, his shotgun loaded, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the gorge, waiting for the first sign of pursuit. Jura moved ahead, his bare feet silent on the stone, and Helena followed, her mind racing through the variables, calculating distances, estimating time. If the gorge ran for 3 miles, and if they could maintain their current pace, they might reach the railway siding by nightfall. If the creature was forced to go around the ridge, it would add hours to its pursuit. They had a chance. A slim, desperate chance, but a chance. The ground began to tremble. It started as a vibration in the soles of their boots, a low-frequency rumble that they might have mistaken for distant thunder, except that the sky above was clear. The tremor intensified, becoming a rhythmic pounding that matched the booming they had heard in the forest, but amplified now by the acoustic properties of the gorge, the stone walls reflecting and concentrating the sound, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The boulders around them began to rattle, small stones dancing on the flat surfaces like popcorn in a hot pan, and the creek's trickle became turbid, the water clouded by sediment shaken from the walls. "It's coming," Jura said, his voice barely audible over the earthquake roar. "Through the forest, it's not going around, it's coming straight for us." Helena looked back. The entrance to the gorge was still visible, a patch of green framed by gray stone, and she saw the trees there begin to move, not swaying in the wind, moving. Being pushed aside, snapped, broken, the trunks of mature eucalypts cracking like matchsticks as something massive forced its way through the undergrowth. The ground shook with each step, a tectonic impact that sent cracks racing through the stone floor of the gorge, and the air filled with the sound of splintering wood and the sulphurous musk that now seemed to permeate the very atmosphere. The creature emerged from the forest and stood at the entrance to the gorge, and for the first time, Helena saw it in full, not as a peripheral flicker or a shadow on a monitor, but as a physical entity occupying space and claiming territory. The Burrunjor was a biological impossibility made flesh, a bipedal nightmare 25 feet from snout to tail, its body covered in a coat of feather-like bristles that were not feathers but scales modified into sensory organs, each one vibrating with the same frequency as the booming, creating a field of perception that extended in all directions. Its head was massive, balanced on a neck that curved like a crane's, and its jaws were lined with teeth that were not daggers but chisels, flat and heavy, and designed for crushing bone rather than slicing meat. The eyes were small and yellow, set deep in bony sockets that gave them a perpetual squint, and they fixed on the survivors with a focus that was not rage but assessment, the cold evaluation of a general surveying a battlefield. The forelimbs were small, almost comically so in proportion to the bulk of the body, but they ended in three-fingered hands that had demonstrated their ability to reach and grip and lift. The hind legs were pillars, the thighs thick as tree trunks, the three-toed feet splayed wide for balance, each claw digging into the clay with a force that left the familiar craters. It stood at the gorge entrance, its head swaying from side to side, and it emitted a booming call that filled the canyon with a pressure that made Helena's vision tunnel and her knees buckle. It did not charge. It did not need to. It knew that the gorge was a trap for them as well as for it, that the narrowing walls would eventually force them into a position where they could not run. It began to move forward, its gait a heavy, rolling walk that covered ground with terrifying efficiency, each step a small earthquake that sent rocks tumbling from the walls. The survivors scrambled backward, their progress impeded by the boulders and the narrowing passage, their panic rising as they realized that the creature was not being deterred by the constriction, but was using it to compress them, to limit their options, to turn the gorge into a funnel that would end in its jaws. Dave fired his shotgun, the blast echoing between the walls in a deafening roar, but the buckshot struck the creature's chest and embedded itself in the dense mat of bristles without apparent effect. The beast flinched, a slight twitch of the head, and then it lowered its snout and emitted a sound that was not a roar but a focused pulse of infrasound, a directed beam of pressure that struck Dave in the chest and lifted him off his feet, hurling him backward into a boulder with a force that snapped his collarbone and drove the air from his lungs in a wet gasp. He slid down the rock, his shotgun clattering away, his eyes rolling back in his head, and the creature stepped over him with the indifference of a man stepping over a threshold, its massive hind foot coming down inches from his skull, the claws leaving parallel gouges in the stone that smoked with friction heat. Helena screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the acoustic chaos of the gorge, and she grabbed Marcus and Petra, pulling them deeper into the narrowing passage. The walls were closing in, the gorge becoming a corridor, then a tunnel, the rock pressing against their shoulders and hips. They squeezed through a gap barely 2 feet wide, their packs abandoned, their bodies scraped and bleeding, and they emerged into a chamber where the floor was flat, and the ceiling rose in a dome of eroded limestone. The Narrows. The map had shown this place, a natural bottleneck where the geological fault had pinched the passage into a slot barely wide enough for a human to pass sideways. And beyond the chamber, visible through the slot, was the continuation of the gorge, widening again into a valley that led, eventually, to the railway siding. They were almost there, but the slot was the problem. It was 12 feet long, 18 inches wide at its narrowest point, a vertical crack in the rock that would require them to exhale and compress their bodies to pass. It would take minutes to navigate, minutes during which they would be trapped, unable to run, unable to fight, their backs pressed against the stone while the creature approached from behind. Helena turned. The Burrunjor was entering the chamber, its bulk filling the entrance, its head lowered to fit beneath the ceiling, its yellow eyes fixed on them with an expression that might have been satisfaction. It had them. It knew it had them. The chamber was a dead end, the slot their only escape, and the creature was too large to follow. But it was also too large to be threatened by anything they could do. It advanced with the slow, rolling gait, each step shaking the floor, and Helena could smell it now, the full force of its musk, a smell of deep caves and ancient decay and the iron tang of blood. Marcus was hyperventilating, his back against the slot, his face a mask of utter despair. Petra had collapsed to her knees, her hands over her ears, her mind finally broken by the proximity of the thing that had haunted her visions. Only Jura remained standing, his spear held in a two-handed grip, his body relaxed in a way that suggested he had accepted his death and was simply waiting for the terms to be presented. Helena's mind raced. She thought of the creature's biology, of the feather-like bristles that covered its body, of the way they vibrated with the booming, creating a sensory field. She thought of the solvent in her pack, the chemical she had used to preserve insect specimens, a high-pressure spray of formaldehyde and ethanol. She thought of the flare gun, the high-frequency screech of its ignition. She remembered Jura's words. The bristles were sensitive. The creature navigated by vibration. What would happen if that vibration were disrupted, if the sensory field were overloaded with contradictory signals? It was a desperate theory, built on folklore and half-remembered physics, but it was the only weapon she had left. She reached into her pack and pulled the spray bottle, her hands shaking so badly she could barely aim it. She looked at Marcus, at the flare gun holstered at his belt, and she shouted, "The flare! Shoot the flare at its face!" "Now!" Marcus, responding to the authority in her voice, drew the weapon with a trembling hand and fired. The flare ignited with a sound like tearing metal, a high-frequency shriek that filled the chamber with blinding white light, and a concussion wave that struck the creature's bristles like a physical blow. At the same moment, Helena squeezed the trigger of her spray bottle, sending a jet of chemical solvent into the creature's face, the liquid atomizing into a cloud that enveloped its snout and eyes. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The Burrunjor reared back, its head striking the chamber ceiling with a force that brought down a rain of stone, its booming call rising in pitch to a scream of confusion and pain. The bristles, overloaded by the competing frequencies of the flare and the infrasound and the chemical irritant, went rigid, standing out from its body like the quills of a porcupine, and the creature began to thrash, its forelimbs flailing, its hind legs scrabbling for purchase on the slick stone. It was blind, temporarily, its sensory field scrambled, its biological navigation system reduced to static and noise. "Go," Helena screamed, pushing Petra toward the slot. "Go now." Marcus dragged Petra into the crack, her body fitting with a terrible slowness, her hips catching on the stone, her screams merging with the creature's roars. Helena followed, squeezing herself into the slot, feeling the rock scrape her ribs and her thighs, feeling the blood run down her legs. Behind her, the creature was recovering, its thrashing becoming more directed, its head turning toward the slot, its jaws snapping at the empty air where she had been. It could not fit. Its shoulders, broad as a truck's fenders, wedged against the stone, and it screamed, a booming call that was amplified by the slot into a physical pressure that made Helena's ears bleed. But it could not reach her. She squeezed through, her body emerging into the wider passage beyond, and she pulled Marcus and Petra with her, the three of them collapsing onto the gravel floor of the gorge's outer chamber, their bodies broken and bleeding but intact. They had made it through the Narrows. The creature was trapped behind them, at least for now, its massive bulk unable to navigate the slot. They did not rest. They could hear the creature still, its booming calls echoing through the slot, its claws scraping the stone as it tried to widen the passage. They ran, or tried to run, their injuries reducing their gait to a shambling jog, their minds operating on pure adrenaline and the primitive refusal to die. The gorge widened, the walls retreating, the sky opening above them in a widening bowl of blue. They emerged from the gorge into a valley that was different from the one they had left, drier, scrubbier, the forest giving way to grassland and the occasional stand of gum trees. And in the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, they saw it. The railway siding, a single set of tracks gleaming in the afternoon sun, a water tower beside them, a small shelter that had once served the cattle trains that ran through this country decades ago. It was the most beautiful sight Helena had ever seen, a symbol of human infrastructure of the world beyond the valley, of safety and order and the triumph of industry over nature. She wanted to weep. She wanted to collapse. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, her eyes fixed on the tracks, her mind chanting a single word: train, train, train. They reached the siding as the sun was beginning to dip toward the western ridge, painting the sky in bands of orange and purple that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. The tracks were rusted but intact, the water tower leaning but functional, the shelter, a corrugated iron box that offered shade and a place to rest. They collapsed inside, their bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion, their minds drifting in and out of consciousness. Marcus found a pipe beside the tracks that still carried a trickle of water, and they drank, the liquid warm and metallic but life-giving. Petra lay in a corner, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but regular, her mind perhaps finding some refuge in the darkness behind her lids. Helena sat in the doorway, her spray bottle clutched in her hand like a talisman, her eyes fixed on the gorge entrance, waiting for the creature to emerge. But the minutes passed, and then the hours, and the creature did not come. The valley remained empty. The tracks remained silent. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Helena allowed herself to believe, for the first time since the tower, that they might survive. It was Marcus who heard it first. A distant rumble, low and rhythmic, that was not the booming of the creature but the sound of diesel engines, of steel wheels on steel rails, of human technology approaching from the east. He scrambled to his feet, his face transformed by a hope that seemed almost painful in its intensity, and he ran to the tracks, waving his arms, his voice cracking as he shouted into the darkness. "Here! We're here! Help us!" Helena joined him, pulling Petra upright, dragging her toward the tracks, their bodies silhouetted against the starlight. The rumble grew louder, and then they saw it. A freight train, a long snake of boxcars and flatbeds moving at a sedate pace, its headlamp cutting a cone of light through the night. It was not a passenger train. It would not stop for hitchhikers. But it was moving, and it was human, and it was leaving the valley, and that was all that mattered. They ran alongside the tracks, their exhausted bodies finding reserves they did not know they possessed, and as the engine passed them, they saw the driver, a silhouetted figure in the cab, his face turned toward them in surprise. The train began to slow, the brakes squealing, the cars clanking together in a decelerating rhythm that sounded like salvation. They reached a flatbed car, its surface loaded with crates of some agricultural product, and Marcus helped Petra climb aboard, lifting her with the last of his strength. Helena followed, her hands finding the metal rungs, her feet scrabbling for purchase, and she pulled herself over the edge and collapsed onto the rough wooden planks of the flatbed. The train was still moving, barely, creeping forward at a walking pace, and she crawled to the edge and looked back. The gorge entrance was visible in the moonlight, a dark slash in the ridge. And standing at the entrance, its body illuminated by the train's retreating headlamp, was the Burrunjor. It had not given up. It had found its way around the ridge, or through some other passage, and it had reached the valley in time to see them escape. It stood on the tracks, its massive body blocking the line, its head raised, its jaws open. And then it let out a booming roar, a call so low and powerful that it vibrated the flatbed beneath them, shook the crates, rattled the chains. It was not a roar of frustration. It was a statement, a declaration. The train began to accelerate, the driver apparently unwilling to share the tracks with a 25-foot apex predator, and the creature let it go. It stood its ground, its three-toed feet planted on the steel rails, its yellow eyes fixed on Helena with a gaze that was not mindless rage but cold, calculating assessment. It knew her now. It had tasted her fear. It had measured her heartbeat. And as the train pulled away, carrying the survivors into the darkness and the safety of the settled world, Helena understood that the Burrunjor was not watching them leave. It was watching them go, with the patience of a landlord seeing off tenants who had overstayed their welcome. It owned the valley. It owned the ridges. It owned the rails. And one day, when the train stopped running and the valley was forgotten again, it would still be there, booming in the silence, clearing the land of invaders, waiting for the next arrogant souls who believed that technology and science could hold back the weight of ancient hunger. The survivors did not speak on the train. They huddled together on the flatbed, wrapped in tarpaulins they found among the crates, their bodies shivering with cold and shock and the delayed trauma of the hours in the gorge. The train carried them through the night, stopping at sidings and yards where no questions were asked of three blood-stained fugitives climbing down from an agricultural flatbed. By morning, they reached a town with a clinic, with telephones, with police who listened to their story with expressions that shifted from concern to disbelief to the careful neutrality of professionals who have heard too many impossible tales. They were separated, questioned, sedated. Their wounds were treated. Their statements were recorded. And eventually they were released, shipped back to Darwin, then to Brisbane, then to their respective homes, where the nightmares waited with the patience of old friends. Helena spent the next month in a hospital in Sydney, recovering from her physical injuries and undergoing evaluation for psychological trauma. She did not tell the psychiatrists about the Burrunjor. She told them about a bear, a crocodile, a freak accident. She knew what the official report would say. A tragic incident in the Northern Territory, a team beset by wildlife, poor planning, insufficient precautions. She knew that no one would believe the truth, and she was not sure she believed it herself, until the day Petra arrived at her hospital room with a hard drive in her hand. The hard drive contained the drone footage. Not the official footage which had been confiscated by the university and sealed under a non-disclosure agreement, but Petra's personal backup, the raw files from the Mavic's memory card. They watched it together on a laptop, the filmmaker's hands trembling as she cued the video. The Emerald Valley, the blood-soaked boot, the hand gripping the laces, and then in the background, the thing in the foliage. Petra had enhanced the image, running it through stabilization software and contrast filters, and what emerged was not a shadow but a shape. A massive, scaly shape with feathered bristles and a head that turned toward the drone with an awareness that was unmistakable. It had known the drone was there. It had allowed itself to be filmed, partially, peripherally, because it understood the camera as it understood the rifle, a tool of the invaders, something to be noted but not feared. And in the final seconds of the footage, as the drone had begun its return flight, the creature had moved. It had reached up with one of its small, three-fingered hands, and it had placed something on a rock. The boot. The hand inside it. A message. A warning. A territorial marker placed with the deliberation of an intelligence that understood symbolism, that communicated not with language but with objects arranged in space. Helena stared at the screen and she understood. The Burrunjor had not been hunting for food. It had been clearing the valley. It had eliminated the competition, the birds, the mammals, the other predators. And then it had turned on the human expedition, not because it was hungry, but because they were invaders. They had entered its territory, set up their sensors and their fences, disturbed the silence with their generators and their voices, and it had responded with the only logic it knew: removal. The boot was not a trophy. It was a boundary marker. The hand was not a message of malice. It was a statement of fact. This is mine. You are not welcome. And as the train had carried them away, the creature had stood on the tracks not to stop them but to watch them go, to ensure that they understood the terms of their departure. The valley belonged to the Burrunjor. The rails were a tolerated intrusion. And one day, when the intrusion ceased, when the last train had passed and the last human had forgotten the Emerald Valley and its blood-soaked warnings, the creature would still be there, booming in the silence. the ancient and patient lord of a land that had never truly been conquered. Helena closed the laptop. Petra looked at her with eyes that held no madness now, only a shared, exhausted comprehension. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had survived, but they had not escaped. The Burrunjor had their scent, their heartbeat, their fear. And in the quiet moments of the night, when the city traffic died down and the air conditioning hummed its mechanical lullaby, Helena could still feel it, the low-frequency vibration in her chest, the booming that synchronized her heart to a rhythm that was not her own. She knew that somewhere in the Emerald Valley, the creature was standing on the rails, its yellow eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, waiting for the next train, the next expedition, the next invasion. And she knew, with a certainty that would haunt her until her death, that one day the trains would stop coming, and the valley would be empty again, and the Burrunjor would fold itself into the canopy with a silence deeper than absence, patient, ancient, and absolutely untouchable, the last monster in a world that had mistaken its patience for extinction. The hospital in Sydney was a temple of antiseptic rationality, a place where the chaos of the Northern Territory was refined into charts and dosages, and the polite fiction that the human mind could be restored with pharmaceuticals and conversation. Helena spent 6 weeks in the trauma ward, her body healing from the lacerations and the hairline fractures and the chemical burns she had not noticed until the adrenaline receded, leaving her skin raw and her nerves exposed. The doctors were kind. The nurses were professional. The psychiatrist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Fenwick with a fondness for taupe cardigans, met with Helena 3 times a week and listened to her edited narrative with a patience that was itself a form of interrogation. Helena told her about the crocodile. She told her about the accident. She told her about the stress of leadership and the guilt of survival, and she watched Dr. Fenwick's pen move across her notepad, translating the unspeakable into the diagnostic language of PTSD and survivor's guilt and acute stress reaction. She did not tell her about the booming. She did not tell her about the hand in the boot. She did not tell her about the way the creature's eyes had looked at her, not with hunger but with assessment, with the cold administrative gaze of something that had been managing its territory for longer than humans had been building hospitals. These things she kept in the locked room of her mind, the room where the lights had been broken and the door had been welded shut from the inside. Marcus Chen did not survive the aftermath. Not physically. His body healed, his collarbone knitted, his lacerations scarred over into pale ribbons. But psychologically, he was dismantled by the experience in a way that made his previous identity unsustainable. He returned to Brisbane and attempted to resume his work, his engineering consultancy, his relationships, but the booming had colonized his nervous system like a virus, and he found himself unable to tolerate enclosed spaces, unable to sleep without medication, unable to hear the low hum of an air conditioner or a refrigerator, without experiencing a full-body paralysis that left him curled on the floor, his heart attempting to synchronize with a rhythm that no longer existed except in his memory. He killed himself on the 14th of March, a quiet Tuesday, leaving a note that read only, "It still hears me." The valley is not far enough. Helena learned of his death from a mutual colleague, and she sat with the news for a long time, staring at the wall of her apartment, her hand pressed against her own chest, feeling the steady, unremarkable beat of her heart and wondering if Marcus had been right, if the creature's infrasound had imprinted on their cardiac tissue like a magnetic tape, if they carried the valley's silence with them wherever they went. Petra became a ghost. She did not return to filmmaking. She did not return to anything. She moved in with her sister in Adelaide and spent her days in a darkened room, the curtains drawn against the Australian sun, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance where the shadows seemed to collect and congeal. She did not speak of the Burrunjor. She did not speak of anything. But once, during Helena's visit, a visit she made out of obligation and guilt, and the desperate need to confirm that she was not the only one who had seen what they had seen, Petra had turned to her with an expression that was almost lucid and had whispered, "It was counting us." In the tower, before it took Brendan, it was counting to make sure it got the right number. Helena had asked what she meant, but Petra had retreated again, her face smoothing into the blank mask of dissociation, and she had not spoken another word for the rest of the visit. The filmmaker died 2 years later, not by her own hand but by attrition, her body failing from malnutrition and neglect, her heart simply stopping one night as if it had finally synchronized with the booming and found the rhythm unsustainable. Helena attended the funeral, a small affair with no media, no university representatives, no acknowledgement of the expedition that had destroyed them all. She stood by the grave and thought of the drone footage, of the boot, of the hand gripping the laces, and she understood that Petra had been right. The creature had been counting. It had known exactly how many of them there were, and it had eliminated them with an efficiency that was not predatory but administrative, the removal of unauthorized personnel from a restricted zone. Jura T. Jungeray disappeared. Not died. Disappeared. He left the hospital in Darwin before the authorities could question him, walking out in the middle of the night with his spear and his kit and his knowledge of the land, and he was not seen again by anyone connected to the expedition. Rumors reached Helena months later. Fragments of stories passed through Aboriginal networks and filtered through the indifference of the mainstream media. He had been seen in the Arnhem Land Plateau, walking alone through the bush, his feet leaving no tracks in the red clay. He had been heard singing, the old songs, the songs that spoke of the Burrunjor not as a monster but as a law, a boundary keeper, a guardian of territories that humans were permitted to visit but never to claim. Some said he had gone back to the valley. Some said he had made a pact with the creature, an exchange of silence for safe passage. Helena did not believe this, but she did not disbelieve it either. She remembered the way Jura had moved through the forest, the way he had known the creature's tactics before they had even seen it, the way he had held his spear in the final moments with the acceptance of a man who understood that the old laws still governed the spaces between the roads. She sent him a letter once, care of a community center in Catherine, but it was returned unopened, the envelope bearing a single mark in red ochre that might have been a warning or a blessing. She kept the envelope in her desk drawer, and sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and trace the mark with her finger, wondering if Jura had made it back to the valley, if he walked now beneath the emerald canopy, if he heard the booming and understood it as conversation rather than threat. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic erasure. The Northern Territory government, in collaboration with the university and the private funding body, produced a document of 200 pages that attributed the expedition's casualties to a combination of wildlife encounters, equipment failure, and poor risk assessment in a remote environment. The deaths of Brendan Akers, Tom Okonkwo, and Dave Coulter were listed as probable crocodile attack, presumed geological accident, and traumatic injury sustained during evacuation, respectively. There was no mention of the tower footage. There was no mention of the footprint. There was no mention of the booming or the creature's strategic sabotage of the vehicles or its ability to pluck a man from a 60-foot platform. The report recommended improved safety protocols, better communication equipment, and mandatory training in remote area survival. It did not recommend further investigation of the valley. It did not recommend a military sweep or a scientific follow-up. The valley was redesignated as a restricted zone, its coordinates removed from public maps, its existence buried under layers of classification that Helena suspected were less about protecting the public and more about protecting the government's liability. The Emerald Valley, with its blood-soaked boot and its patient, ancient landlord, was erased from the official record, becoming a rumor, a footnote, a story told by rangers around campfires to warn new recruits against wandering into unsurveyed sectors. But the footage remained. Petra's hard drive, which Helena had kept after the filmmaker's death, sat in a safe deposit box in a Sydney bank, its contents illegal, its existence denied by every authority that had investigated the incident. Helena did not look at it often. The memory of the creature was sufficient to populate her nightmares, and she did not need digital confirmation of what she had seen with her own eyes. But on the anniversary of the escape, the anniversary of the train and the flatbed and the booming that had shaken the cars as they pulled away, she would go to the bank, and she would sit in the private viewing room, and she would watch the drone footage again. She had done this 3 times now. Each time, she noticed something new. The first time, she had noticed the creature's patience, the way it had allowed the drone to film the boot before it moved, as if it understood the camera's function and was using it to disseminate its message. The second time, she had noticed the hand in the boot, the wedding ring, the way the fingers had been positioned to grip the laces with a rigor that suggested the limb had been prepared, arranged, presented. The third time, she had noticed something that made her stop the video and rewind it and watch it again, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the mouse. In the final seconds of the footage, as the drone had begun its automatic return sequence and the creature had slipped back into the foliage, she saw a reflection. The creek, smooth as glass before the boot, had captured a distorted image of the scene from below, and in that reflection she saw not one creature but 2. The Burrunjor in the trees and another, smaller shape standing on the opposite bank, watching the drone with the same yellow eyes, the same feathered bristles, the same patient assessment. There were 2 of them, a breeding pair, or a parent and child. The valley had not been cleared by a solitary predator. It had been cleared by a family. This realization, when it came, did not destroy Helena. She had already been destroyed, reconstructed from the ruins of her scientific certainty into something harder and more brittle, a woman who no longer believed in the manageable world. She understood now why the creature had not pursued them beyond the tracks. It had not needed to. The valley was its nursery, its territory, its kingdom, and the train was simply the boundary of a larger domain that it tolerated but did not claim. The rails were a line in the sand, and as long as the humans stayed on the rails, they were safe. But the forest belonged to the Burrunjor, and the Burrunjor belonged to the forest, and the distinction between the two had long since dissolved into a single, continuous organism of appetite and patience. She thought of Marcus's note, of Petra's whispered counting, of Jura's disappearance into the old songs, and she understood that they had all been marked, all been measured, all been filed away in the creature's memory as invaders who had been successfully repelled. The question was not whether it would hunt again. The question was when the next expedition would come, the next developers, the next arrogant souls with their censors and their fences and their belief that the world could be catalogued, and whether the creature would still be there to receive them, to count them, to eliminate them with the same patient efficiency it had demonstrated in the Emerald Valley. Helena left Sydney in the winter of the 3rd year. She sold her apartment, cashed out her retirement accounts, and bought a small property in Tasmania, an island at the southern edge of the continent where the forests were different, older, quieter in a way that did not feel predatory. She lived alone, growing vegetables, keeping chickens, writing letters to politicians and environmental agencies that she never sent. She developed a habit of standing in her doorway at dusk, listening to the sounds of the bush, cataloging the birds and the mammals and the insects with a thoroughness that was part penance and part vigilance. She wanted to know, always, whether the silence was coming. She wanted to be the first to notice when the birds stopped singing, when the kangaroos vanished, when the air began to hum with a frequency that matched the rhythm of her own frightened heart. Her neighbors thought her eccentric. The local doctor treated her for anxiety and prescribed medication that she did not take. She was waiting. She did not know what she was waiting for, only that the waiting was necessary, a form of prayer to a God that did not answer in words but in absences, in the spaces between sounds where something massive and scaly shifted its weight, and prepared to claim what had always been its own. On the 5th anniversary of the expedition, Helena received a package. It had no return address, no postage stamp, no markings of any kind. It was simply there on her doorstep one morning, a wooden box the size of a shoebox, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of eucalyptus and sulfur. She knew before she opened it what it would contain, but she opened it anyway, because some doors, once suspected, must be opened or they will drive you mad with wondering. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried grass and red clay, was a single object, a claw. Not a tooth, not a scale, not a feather. A claw, black and curved and heavy as a wrench, 3 inches long at the base and tapering to a needle point that could punch through aluminum. It was one of the Burrunjor's claws, or a replica indistinguishable from the original, and it had been placed in the box with the same deliberation that the creature had placed the boot on the rock. A message. A reminder. A territorial marker sent through channels that Helena could not trace, carried by hands she could not identify, delivered to her doorstep 5 years and 3,000 kilometers from the valley. She did not touch it. She stared at it for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and then she looked up at the tree line that bordered her property. The Tasmanian forest was quiet. The birds were singing. The wind moved through the branches with a sound like whispers. But somewhere in the back of her mind, in the locked room where the lights had been broken, she heard the booming. She heard the rotors humming. She saw the hand gripping the laces. And she knew that the Burrunjor did not forget. It did not forgive. It simply waited, patient and ancient and absolutely untouchable, for the day when the rails rusted and the train stopped and the invaders finally learned that the valley and everything it touched had never been theirs to claim. She buried the box in the garden, deep beneath the roots of a eucalypt that had been growing since before her grandmother was born. She did not mark the grave. She did not tell anyone. But every evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and the shadows lengthened across her small plot of land, she would stand at the window and she would listen. And in the silence between the bird calls, in the pauses between the rustling of leaves, she would sometimes catch it. A vibration, low and rhythmic, not loud enough to hear but powerful enough to feel. A pressure in her chest that made her heart stutter and her blood slow. It was not the Burrunjor. It could not be. The distance was too great, the terrain too different, the ecology too separate. But the feeling was the same. The patience was the same. The weight of being watched by something that had never been conquered, never been catalogued, never been understood was the same. And she would stand there, her hand pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the window, and she would whisper the same words every night, a prayer and a warning and a promise. I know you're there. I know you're waiting, and I'm still listening. The valley remained. The train still ran, though less frequently now, the freight lines declining in the face of road transport and economic contraction. The emerald green persisted, untended and unobserved, the camera traps having long since been consumed by rust and vine. And in the center of the valley, on a flat-topped rock beside the seasonal creek, the boot still stood. The blood had long since faded to a rust-colored stain, the leather cracked and peeling, the laces frayed by wind and weather. But the hand was still there, desiccated now, mummified by the dry season and the passage of years, the wedding ring still circling the bone, the fingers still curled in their grip. It was a monument, a warning, a boundary marker placed by an intelligence that understood the language of symbols and the power of absence. And once a year, when the wet season was at its peak and the creek ran high and the forest steamed with the breath of 1,000 invisible lives, the Burrunjor would emerge from the canopy and it would stand beside the rock and it would look at the boot, and it would listen. It would listen for the rotors. It would listen for the voices. It would listen for the hearts of the invaders, beating their frightened rhythms in the darkness beyond the ridges. And when it heard nothing, when the valley was empty and the silence was complete, it would turn and it would fold itself back into the green, patient, ancient, and absolutely untouchable, the lord of a land that had never been conquered and never would be, waiting for the next train, the next expedition, the next arrogant soul who believed that science could measure the weight of a hunger that had outlived empires. Helena died in her sleep on a Tuesday in November, 15 years after the expedition. She was found in her bed, her face peaceful, her hand resting on her chest as if she had been listening to her own heart and had found, finally, a rhythm that matched the silence. The coroner ruled it natural causes, cardiac arrest, nothing suspicious. But her neighbor, an elderly woman who had sometimes joined Helena for tea and who had noticed her habit of standing at the window each evening, reported something strange. On the night Helena died, just after midnight, the woman had woken to a sound that was not a sound but a pressure, a low booming vibration that had shaken her windows and synchronized her heart to a tempo that was not her own. It had lasted for exactly 1 minute, 40 seconds. And then it had stopped and the forest had been silent, and in the morning Helena had been found. The neighbor did not include this in her official statement. She knew what it sounded like. She knew what the authorities would say. But she kept a journal, and in it she wrote. Something said goodbye to her. Something measured her heart and found it ready to stop. Something that had been waiting for 15 years finally decided that the debt was paid. The journal was found after the neighbor's death, years later, and it was read by a grandniece who dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman who had spent too much time alone in the bush. But she kept the journal, and she kept the story, and she passed it on to a friend who was studying environmental biology at the University of Queensland, a young woman with a specialty in apex predator ecology and a reputation for fearlessness that bordered on recklessness. And the young woman, reading the journal late one night, felt a strange compulsion to look at a map, to find the coordinates of a valley in the Northern Territory that was marked unsurveyed, to wonder what might be waiting in the emerald green, patient and ancient and absolutely untouchable, beneath the rotors of a drone and the gaze of a camera that had not yet learned the difference between documentation and invitation. The valley waited, the boot stood, the hand gripped the laces, and in the silence between the bird calls, something massive and scaly shifted its weight and prepared once more to clear the land of invaders. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.